2 episodes ago, I introduced you to what I think is the best analogy for capturing the relationship between God and creation. That analogy being the relationship between the author of a story and the story the author conceives of. I also explored some possible areas of theology in which that analogy might help us to think better about those particular areas of theology. Last episode, I had my friend and boss at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, Braxton Hunter, come on the show to discuss the analogy and push back and offer alternatives. And one of the things that came up during that conversation, which was expected, is that the analogy seems to suit a determinist and Calvinist soteriology better than a non-Calvinist one, like that which Braxton Hunter holds. So we talked about that in last episode. And this week, we're going to have another guest on, this time a fellow Calvinist, to discuss how we Calvinists and determinists might be able to leverage this analogy in areas of soteriology without falling prey to the charge that Calvinism and determinism make God out to be the author of evil. And one of the things that we'll be exploring is how the difference between two particular authors in reality, namely Leo Tolstoy on the one hand and Fyodor Dostoevsky on the other hand, how it is that the relationship or the differences between these two authors might help us to identify some God as author analogies which are better than others. All of that and more on this episode of Theopologetics. This is Chris Date, and welcome to Theopologetics, where every other week I discuss a wide variety of theological issues and show how a properly biblical worldview can help defend the historic Christian faith from its critics. Join me as we think through what we believe and why we believe it, and not something else. Welcome to another episode of Theopologetics. My name is Chris Date, and if you're not already aware, this show is part of the Trinity Commission, a network of podcasts and YouTube channels that in one way, shape, or form or another they have a connection with Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. I, for example, am an adjunct professor of Bible and theology at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary, and if you're interested in a Christian higher education that is affordable, both in terms of money and in terms of time, then I'd encourage you to check out Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary by going to Trinity Sem, that's S-E-M as in short for seminary, trinitysem.edu, where you can get that very kind of affordable higher Christian education and possibly take a class there with me. The other shows that are part of this Trinity Commission include the Bible Bro Down, Trinity Radio, which is hosted by the president of Trinity, Braxton Hunter, and a few other shows as well. So if you're interested in following those other shows and don't already, then go to Facebook and search for the Trinity Commission and you'll be able to find that and learn more there. Also, just as a heads up, if you were somebody that has been following along the Biblical Hebrew 101 lectures that I have been pushing out at an irregular cadence, and if you've been waiting for the third lecture in that series, well, you don't need to wait anymore. I just recently published the third lecture right here in this channel. So now Biblical Hebrew 101 has 3 lectures, seminary quality lectures on how to read Biblical Hebrew. First on the Hebrew alphabet, the consonants that make up the Hebrew alphabet, and then the second lecture was on vowels and other markings that are collectively known as the system called Nikud, the individual markings called Nikudot. And now the third lecture in the series is available, which is on how to start putting those things together to form nouns. Also, I will be publishing a video in the very near future on how to start learning how to type Hebrew, as I think that will benefit you as you do as you study Biblical Hebrew. So I just wanted to make you aware of those. I don't really have much else to say except perhaps actually there are two more things I'll want to say. Firstly, we are now 1 week as of today into a new program that Jonathan Pritchett has started, a new sort of body transformation program that involves resistance band training. If you're interested in doing that, it's not too late to get on the bandwagon. Just check out the Theology Geek Fitness group at Facebook or the Theology Geeks Fitness YouTube channel. And you'll be able to learn more. As I said, we're 1 week into it, and I'm already experiencing benefits that I'm appreciative of. And so, if you want to make a change for your physical health, this might be for you. It's not a new thinner six packs abs in 6 weeks or that kind of thing. No, this is a 24-week program meant to establish something that will last, and not something that will that will benefit you in the short term, but then you'll give it up and revert to old ways and it'll disappear. No, this is meant to be a lasting change, that a lifestyle change that Jonathan Pritchett is taking us through. So I'd encourage you to check that out. And the only other thing I'll just mention is on a personal note, a bit of a prayer request. I think I've mentioned this on my other stream, Rethinking Hell Live. I and a co-editor, a name you will almost assuredly be familiar with, that's Paul Copan. He was one of my fellow plenary speakers at the most recent Rethinking Hell conference. He and I have submitted a book proposal that we've crafted together to a big Christian academic publisher, and we're waiting to hear back from them. This would be a phenomenal opportunity for me personally in terms of my academic career. I don't have a terminal degree yet, and if I were to get published by a big name Christian academic publisher, that would be huge for my PhD applications in the near future, and eventually, job applications for teaching. But it would also, I think, be a very important contribution to the debate, the intramural Christian debate over the nature of hell, and help progress that debate and the conversation therein in meaningful ways. So I think it'll be a very valuable resource if a publisher picks it up, and both Paul and I would love to make this first publisher that we have approached be the one that accepts our proposal. So be praying about that, and if we are blessed enough to get our proposal accepted, then you'll very soon hear more from me, the details about what the book is going to be. So with all of that out of the way, I guess I'll stop blabbering on and rambling pseudo-incoherently, and let me tell you just very briefly about the interview guest that you're going to be watching here in a moment. I actually don't know this person personally and wasn't very familiar with him at all, but when I started planning the series that you're watching right now of Theopologetics, where we're exploring the God as author analogy, I happened to notice an announcement on Facebook from one of my Facebook connections saying that he was about to submit a master's thesis on the very topic of the God as author analogy, and what's more, the topic of this thesis was going to be on how it might be used to support Calvinistic determinism without falling prey to the charge that determinism and Calvinism make God out to be the author of evil. As you can imagine, I saw this as fairly providential and thought, hey, this would be great to include as an episode of this series that I'm doing on the God as author analogy. And so I reached out to the person who posted that. His name is Parker Settecase, and I learned that he has a blog and a podcast and a YouTube channel, and it was just fascinating reading his thesis. I asked him if he would be willing to share it with me and then let me ask him about it in an episode of the show, and he graciously agreed, and it was absolutely fascinating. And the conversation that we had, I think, was very fascinating as well, and I think you'll enjoy it, whether or not you share my impression that Parker's approach does in fact make determinism supportable without making God the author of evil in a meaningful sense. So I think you'll find it fascinating either way, and I hope that you will provide feedback in the comments section after the show is over. This conversation that I had with Parker is pre-recorded, but I will be in the live chat throughout most of the replay, which will begin here momentarily. So if you have questions or thoughts, I may be able to engage while the pre-recorded interview is playing. And then after the pre-recorded interview is done, I'll come back in to bid you adieu and sign off. So without further ado, let's go ahead and dive right into my interview with Parker Settecase on how the God as author analogy can support Calvinism theism and determinism without making God out to be the author of evil. Here we go. Faith in Christ from a very early age, or was it something that you came to embrace later in life?
Yeah, dude. Again, man, thanks so much for having me on here. This is awesome. I did grow up in a Christian home.
Parker, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate having you on, and I want to do what I often do at the beginning of interviews with guests that have not been on my shows before, which is ask you about your faith background or testimony. Were you raised in a Christian household, and did you affirm faith in Christ from a very early age, or was it something that you came to embrace later in life?
Yeah, dude. Again, man, thanks so much for having me on here. This is awesome. I did grow up in a Christian home. I was raised in an EV-free church, and my parents love the Lord. My dad knows the Lord like no one else I know. He raised us to love the Lord, but at a very early age, started living kind of two different lives: who I was with my folks and who I was with the wrestling team, the football team, all sorts of stuff like that, and super duplicitous lifestyle. And also, we went to church in the Promised Land. That's Wheaton, Illinois. And I learned at a very early age that you tuck in your sweater vest and you leave your sin at the door. You know, we don't talk about that messy stuff here. And so it wasn't until college where I got involved with this ministry called Athletes in Action. And there I saw dudes that I look up to and respect on the wrestling team, confessing their sins to each other, battling pornography with each other, all sorts of stuff like that, confessing, watching out for each other's backs. It was awesome. And then I got to see like what Christian brothers really do, what Christianity really looks like, people extending grace to each other, trusting in Jesus. It's been awesome. So it wasn't until my junior year of college that I'd say I really came to embrace the faith and then surrender my life to Jesus. And I said, Lord, whatever you want me to do, I'll do. Whatever you want me to say, I'll say. Wherever you want me to go, I'll go. I don't care. My life is for you. And yeah, since then he's completely changed my life around. It's been awesome.
Praise God. You know, there are lots of Christians with stories like that, but there are also lots of Christians whose faith tends to stay at something of a very lay level, whereas you are one of these people, one of these Christians who have, for one reason or another, found the study of some deep area of theology, like systematic theology or philosophical theology or whatever. They dive really deep into those and become, you know, much more thoughtful and deep thinking, I think, in certain areas than sort of the average ordinary Christian, which is not in any way to disparage them, but it does make me want to ask, what is it, how did you become really interested in the complexities of systematic theology such that you would, as we'll discuss momentarily, devote your master's education to systematic theology, let alone your master's thesis? How did you develop this love and this passion for systematic theology?
Yeah, well, dude, so I gave my life to Christ. I fully surrendered. Whether I was a Christian beforehand, I still wrestle with that, but I fully surrendered to the Lord after my junior year of college, and I was a little bit embarrassed. Like, I have grown up in the church my whole life. My dad would make us read the Bible in the morning, and I didn't know any of it. I just didn't know, and so I was embarrassed. Like, I should know all this stuff. People would ask me questions, and I had like terrible answers for them, and so right after that, I started living with one of my teammates, one of my best friends now, and he's a big skeptic. And so he kept on asking me, "Hey, why do you believe this? Why do you go to church? What are you doing on Sunday? Why are you doing this? Why don't you do this? Why do you do this? Why don't you believe? What about Buddhism? What about this?" And I just didn't have good answers. I had good enough answers to like get him off my back, but I knew if he would ask me another question, I would have been completely stumped. I don't know why I believe what I believe, and so I started getting to apologetics. And then studying apologetics, I realized, man, I should know the theology behind this. I started reading my Bible a ton as well, but I need to know the theology behind this. And started getting into some more systematic theology. Started with Kevin Van Hooser, John Frame, just some of these Reformed giants. And then I from there, I thought, well, I also need to know some more philosophy. And so I started studying some philosophy, and that's how I got into systematic and philosophical theology.
Awesome. You have a blog, a podcast, and a YouTube channel called Parker's Pensies. Do you want to tell the viewers a little bit about what sorts of things you cover there in those places? And at the end of the show, I'll tell them, or I'll ask you to tell them how they can find these things online.
Yeah, for sure. So it's called Parker's Pensies. I understand that it's Pensies, but I'm an American swine, right? So I'm not going to be pretentious about it. And I named that after Blaise Pascal's pensées or pensées. And Pascal died before he could finish this book, and so we're kind of left trying to put the pieces together. And I thought, if I wait until I'm done with all my education, I could get hit by a bus tomorrow, and I got all these thoughts I want to share with people, so I'm just going to put them out there. So I started with my blog, and I blog. It started more with apologetics and kind of moved into some more philosophy, some theology, just some random stuff too. But I do some series in there where I'll go through like intro to philosophy kind of stuff, intro to logic, just little things like that. As I learn, I try to teach as well, because that's how I learn best. And then I have a YouTube channel because I put up this frog video. I had these giant African bullfrogs, and it ended up getting, right now it's got 37 million views, this one video. So I got this huge platform, and I'm like, well, how do I convert this into, teaching people about theology? So I started this podcast, and so far it's hard to get all the frog people over into the theology, but we're working on it. So yeah, and so my podcast is by the same name.
Very cool. Well, like I said, at the end of the show, I'll have you tell listeners, viewers, where they can go to find it. But one last question in this sort of introductory portion where we're just getting to know you. You have, we're going to talk a little bit about your master's thesis, but your master's thesis is being done at the school you're getting your master's in systematic theology, which is Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, or TEDS, as it's often called. Why did you choose TEDS for your master's, and what do you hope to do in the future with that degree under your belt, as it were?
Yeah, so I came here because of D.A. Carson. The dude's a legend. I'd watched hours and hours and hours of his videos. I really love that guy, and also became interested in this young lady, and turns out she works as an athletic trainer here at Trinity in the undergrad. So we got married, and then found out that because she's worked here for 3 years, I get a tuition waiver. So I haven't paid for any classes, which has been awesome. But I did find out that the year I got here, D.A. Carson retired. So that was really sad. But I did get to take a class last winter with him, like an intensive class, like 5 days, 8 hours a day kind of thing, which is pretty awesome. So I came to TEDS because of these. I'm an evangelical. I love being evangelical. I love that name. I love that moniker. I'm not letting go of it. I love TEDS because it's a evangelical bastion, and I got to come here for free. So actually, I'm doing 2 master's degrees, one in systematic theology, one in theological studies, and they dropped their philosophy of religion program. So I'm basically just doing a philosophy of religion with systematic and some languages in there as well. And then Lord willing, I'll be applying to a terminal master's degree in philosophy pretty soon this month. I would love to go on and do a master's in philosophy, and then, Lord willing, a PhD in philosophy as well. I'd love to be a philosophy prof and teach at a seminary nearby, adjunct. I think that would be like dream come true for me, but yeah, we'll see.
Well, I for one, hope those dreams come true, if for no other reason than that as a not very philosophically oriented Calvinist, I love discovering very philosophically oriented Calvinists like Guillaume Bignon and hopefully yourself as well. So I'll be praying that your dreams come true.
Awesome.
So let's transition into the topic of our discussion today. And and viewers, if this isn't their very first episode, will know that I have been doing a series of which there have been 2 parts thus far, discussing the analogy of the analogy of an author of a story as an analogy meant to help us to understand better the relationship between God and creation. And so a couple of episodes ago, I spent an hour or so attempting to justify the analogy, and then walking through what I saw as some possible applications, some really underdeveloped and inchoate applications of the analogy, but nevertheless areas where I think there may be some fruit to be born there. And then in last episode, I had my friend Braxton Hunter, who's also my boss at Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. He is not a Calvinist, and we spent a lot of our time discussing how this analogy might inform a discussion around Calvinism and determinism, although we also covered such things as the incarnation and anthropological dualism versus physicalism, things like that. So this is the discussion I want to continue with you for reasons that viewers will find out here in just a moment. But to sort of get this topic started, how did you become first interested in this analogy of God as being like the author of a story, such that it would consume as much of your thought as is necessary to write a thesis on it, as we'll be talking about shortly?
Yeah. So I believe that I first came upon it through the writings of C.S. Lewis. He's got For those who don't know, he has just an amazing amount of essays, and I think his essays are probably the best. But there's an essay called "The Seeing Eye," and he's writing against when the Russians first went into space, and they go. One of them famously said, "I see no God up here," and Lewis is writing against it. Like, if you could see God up there, then that would disprove the kind of God I believe in. What are you talking about? And so he ended up saying God relates to creation the way an author relates to a story. So it's no surprise that you wouldn't find him as some being up there behind the moon or something. And so once I first heard that, I was deep into apologetics and just kind of stuck in my mind. And then I would listen to all sorts of Desiring God stuff. And Kevin Van Hooser was there for a C.S. Lewis conference, and I believe he talked about the drama of doctrine, very famous phrase by him. And he talked about God being relating to creation like in a drama or in a play. And so that play motif was kind of in my mind as well. And then just ruminating on it for a couple of years and seeing there's a great book, Calvinism and the Problem of Evil, philosophical theologians and philosophers talking about God and evil. And several of them use that motif as well. So just over the years, been ruminating on it.
Very cool. Having had the displeasure of watching one or both of those previous episodes I mentioned, do you share, just out of curiosity, my criticisms of the other analogies that I proposed people might conjure up in their minds when they're thinking about the relationship between God and creation? Things like puppet and a puppeteer, or a painting and its artist, or even something like the creator of the World of Warcraft, massively multiplayer online role-playing game. And I walked through why I think there are deficiencies in each of these analogies that aren't equally suffered by the God as author analogy. And so do you agree with me at least on most of my criticisms of those analogies, and would you agree that at least some form of the God as author analogy succeeds in ways that those other ones don't?
Yeah, I actually do. Yeah, I definitely agree with you on that. And I think while some of those might be helpful at various times, I think they fall apart more quickly. People always say, every analogy breaks down. I actually think a certain analogy for the God-world relation, the God as author motif, I think a particular one of those doesn't break down. And that's what we'll be talking about tonight. But I think that it actually picks out one of the essential things that God wants to reveal to us, namely that he's a speaker. God speaks. The first thing we hear about him, he says, "Let there be light." Right? He's a creator, but he creates by his word. And other analogies don't pick that out as well. I actually wrote another paper for Dr. Van Hooser this semester just now. The authorial analogy versus the simulation hypothesis. So I was really interested to hear your last conversation there with Braxton. If you were to take it, so the problem with that analogy, there's lots of them, I think. The problem is when you use that univocally, when you say like we are literally living in a computer simulation, I think there's all sorts of problems with cognition then, and it's kind of self-defeating. Braxton took it more as an analogy. I think it's actually best if you're going to use it theologically as a metaphor, something that is not literally true, but in metaphorical language is kind of an intuition pump to think about it, to think about God. But I think it breaks down precisely for what you were saying, that it's not picking out essentially what we want, that God speaks. God's not a programmer. We might think of him as if, we might make a simile, we might make a metaphor that God is like, you can think of him that way. But I want to say God is literally an author. God literally creates with words in the same manner, in a similar manner that we do. It's analogical. It's not univocal. God's not in Starbucks writing with a pen and paper or clicking away on his computer, but he literally creates with words, and we literally create with words. So that's why I think the analogy and the authorial analogy is more apt. It's better. It's a better explanation for God's relation to the world. And I think you did a great job on that. Yeah.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. One thing I think you've done a great job with is your master's thesis, which I've had the pleasure of reading, at least sort of a yet untouched up version of it. And the title of it, at least at the time that you gave me a copy of it, was "Contending with the Divine Writer's Block, Van Hooser's Analogia Auctoris," or authorial analogy, and the problem of authoring evil. So this is a thesis you've done to complete, I'm assuming, your Master of Arts in Systematic Theology at TEDS. Tell us, you already talked about how you became interested in the analogy in the first place. What took it from that level to, I want to do all of the work that goes into writing a master's thesis on it?
Yeah, so like I said earlier, I want to go into philosophy, and maybe, dude, I don't know. The Lord could do whatever He wants, but eventually it would be kind of cool to come back into theology. But that's going to be a long time from now. So I figured while I'm here, let's try and just suck as much out of this time at TEDS as I can. And so I decided to add another master's, systematic theology, and I found out that you could write a thesis for it. And most people write two short papers, two 30-page papers. And people were warning me, it's a lot of work, but I wanted to do the work. I wanted to have a defense. I wanted to put an idea out there, and I want to advance something. And something that's a little discouraging about Van Hooser's students, many of whom I know and I love them, his PhD students, I haven't seen a ton of them advance his work. And that's a shame, because in my mind, he's the best systematic theologian that's alive right now. And so it's hard to advance his work because he's so witty and he does so many different things. It's hard. It's almost sad to abstract out what he's saying from all the puns that he does. So there's that, but it's just tough. It's tough to advance his stuff because it's so Van Hooseran. So I wanted to do that as well. I wanted to say, what can I do to help this analogy forward? And I love philosophy, so maybe I can drag some philosophy into this and not reinvent, but re-explain, repristinate his idea in philosophical thought. And so that's what I did. And I asked him about it. I wanted to work on God and time. And he said, it doesn't matter, because as soon as you do that, someone's going to raise the problem of evil. So you need to work on the problem of evil. And it just so happened that he'd wanted some work done on that anyway. So it worked out really well. And I had just recently taken a course on an upper level course on the problem of evil from Dr. Feinberg. So yeah, it was all fresh in my mind, and it kind of fell together.
Awesome. And if I'm not mistaken, in fact, I know I'm not mistaken because I saw you post about this on Facebook not long ago, but it was just a few hours ago that you defended your thesis, and from what I can tell, successfully. How'd your defense go, if you could tell us anything specific, and was Van Hooser there, and if so, what did he think?
Yeah. So Van Hooser was my first reader. So when you're defending a thesis, you don't have chairs. It's like this. It's like a mini doctoral dissertation, probably like 100 pages less or something like that. So mine was 115 pages. So I had a first reader and a second reader, and Dr. Feinberg was my second. Dr. Van Hooser my first. And we started off, master's thesis, not a PhD. It's not that big a deal. It's and they both were very flattering, very encouraging. It was huge. But then we kind of went to war. We did some battle here. They took me up hard on the my notion of analogy, what I'm stipulating as what I'm saying an analogy is, because Dr. Van Hooser took a class at called Metaphor and Analogy. And so this dude has got, deep study in these particular terms. And then Dr. Feinberg has done, he did a PhD in philosophy at University of Chicago, and his dissertation was on the problem of evil. And so two things that these guys really have strong opinions on and are really well versed in. And so, yeah, it was supposed to go like under an hour. It ended up going an hour 45 because we were just going back and forth. And I'd been thinking about this for, 7 years or something. So I didn't want to back down. They didn't want to back down. And it was really fun. It was really encouraging that they would take it seriously enough to come at me.
Yeah.
And I was so exhausted afterwards. But it was good. It helped me out a lot. And I ended up, I need to add 2 sentences and correct a couple typos, and then I'm set.
Awesome.
So yeah, I passed, which was great.
Yeah, congratulations. That's really cool. I really wanted
Thanks.
to do a master's thesis at Fuller, but they're not doing master's theses anymore, so that was a bit of a bummer.
Yeah.
Now let's start to dive into your thesis then and go through it chapter by chapter. And you mentioned something that'll be a nice segue into it, because you said that one of the things that Van Hooser in particular pushed back on you on was the distinction between analogy and metaphor. And that's a distinction that you work out in the first chapter of your thesis. And also in this chapter, you defend the use of analogies to help understand the relationship between God and creation. So to get the ball rolling, summarize for us some of the major points that you make in this first chapter.
Yeah. So I want to make a distinction in saying analogy or something is analogous. There's a lot of things that are close to that. There's similes, there's metaphors, there's allegories, there's all different ways and conceptual tools we can use for comparing two things. And so I wanted to say, well, what is an analogy? So I go through and give some different types of analogies. There's explanatory analogies, And there's all sorts. We don't have to get into all that again, because this could take up everything. That's another warning that Dr. Van Hooser said. But it's important to define our terms. That's something that a good philosopher does, and I want to be a good philosopher. So I went through and I said, what kind of analogy is being used when we compare God to an author? And I came down saying that it's an explanatory analogy. We're trying to explain something that's less known by something that's more fully known. And so, theologically, you might take issue with that and say, well, God is fully known to us because we're made in his image. And it's like, well, we do suppress the truth in unrighteousness, and the doctrine of incomprehensibility is at play as well. Like we can know God truly, but we don't know God fully. And if we can use a concept that we have a better grasp on to help us understand God, then that's a really good thing. And so that's the type of analogy. I call it an explanatory analogy. And I've picked that up from a couple logicians, people who teach and study logic, but mostly from Irving Copey. He really helped me out with that one. So it's an explanatory analogy. It's not a descriptive analogy. We're not just describing. We're using it to argue. We're using it to further elucidate, to breed some more understanding. So an explanatory analogy, but it's also a strong analogy. And here's I make a distinction, which again I picked up from some philosophers, Baggini and Fossil in their Philosopher's Toolkit, which is a great book. They describe two different types of analogies: a strong analogy and a weak analogy. And a strong analogy is strong when the things being compared, one, they share a decisive number of relevant similarities, and then two, they do not exhibit a large or decisive number of relevant differences. So then a weak analogy is the opposite. It's an analogy that does not share a large number of relevant similarities and does exhibit a lot of disanalogy, relevant dissimilarities, differences.
And this wouldn't be a binary category as much as something like a spectrum from weak to strong, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Because some are going to exhibit more or less similarities and more immediate disanalogies. So that's another important conception. I think that the authorial analogy is a strong analogy. Like it's further along on that spectrum, closer to the strong end, because I argue that there are, and Dr. Van Hooser argues as well, that there's a lot of relevant similarities and not a lot of relevant dissimilarities when you're comparing God to an author. Yeah. And I think that, again, we want to ground this all in Scripture as well. It's not just, you're not sitting in our armchairs. We're trying to say, how do we make sense of the biblical phenomena here? Oh yeah, it's a strong analogy. And here's where they did push back, and this was helpful. As soon as I was done writing, I picked up another book that I had used. It's called Metaphor, and it's by Eva Feder-Kitty. I think I'm pronouncing that right. It's a great book. It's an Oxford book. But she talked about how all metaphors are analogies, but not all analogies are metaphors. And this is something kind of hit me on. They said, well, can you just explain the difference between between that relation? It's asymmetrical. And that was something I should have touched on. So yeah, I'll be adding just a sentence on that. But so for a metaphor to be a good metaphor, there has to be an analogy in there. But this is why a strong and weak analogy is important. Metaphors are weak analogies. They may have one thing that's common between the two things being compared. So you say like, this dude's like a fox, man. That guy's a real fox. What are you saying there? Maybe you're saying that he's crafty, right? And so that's the one thing. But does he have orange fur on his face, right? No, there's a lot of disanalogies. There's a lot of dissimilarities. So I would say that's a metaphor, and it's literally false. Like if you take that, he's not actually a fox. But when you think about it in a metaphorical sense, that makes sense. It helps me understand a little bit more about how you're describing him. So that's why I would make that distinction. I think strong and weak is helpful for us when thinking through analogies. So at this point, we have a strong explanatory analogy. That's the type of analogy that we're working with when we say God is an author.
Yeah. One of the if not only major difference, arguably, between the way the relationship between God and creation really is and the relationship between the author and a story. One of the major differences people are going to allege, in fact, this came up a number of times in my discussion with Braxton, is that the world created by an author in his or her mind, the characters in that story aren't real. And I grant that, but what would it mean for human beings and the rest of the cosmos to be real to a God who transcends that created order? I don't even know if we can conceive of what that would be like, and would it be significantly unlike the way in which world is real in the mind of its author, real to its author? This isn't a question I sent you in advance, but it just occurred to me. How, to what extent do you think that that's a legitimate a legitimate claim of disanalogy between the author and story analogy compared to the God creation relation?
Yeah, and that's one of the first one that comes up all the time. I've talked with some of my philosopher friends about this work, and they go, "Yeah, okay, maybe it can work," but there's this immediate disanalogy because those characters aren't real. And so, what I would say there is that in analogical predication, making a predication that's analogous, that's using an analogy that's analogical, not univocal, not in the exact same sense, and not equivocal in different senses, which is a fallacy, but in using one that's analogical, we're stretching the conception in order to fit both the things we're talking about. And so Kitty uses this guy, James F. Ross, his terminology. He talks about analogical shifts in meaning. So then there's these three instances of she dropped her paint can, that's one. She dropped her hem, that's two. And she dropped her stitch. And each one of those is literally talking about dropped is being used literally, but the semantic range is being stretched to fit all of those. So you can literally speak, you can literally predicate about a can and a hem and a stitch and use drop to do that. And so what I would say here is that we create with pen and paper. We create, when we author things, we create with pen and paper. We create with our imaginations. I don't want to go into possible world semantics. Some people would say that like Bilbo Baggins actually exists in a possible world, just not this one, or he exists in our minds, right? We create with our imaginations. God creates with time and space. So God is an author, but his medium is time and space. But we're sub-authors. And so if you want to be like technical about it, I would say no one actually authors anything except for God. He authors ex nihilo, but we are sub-authors. We use all the stuff that he's already authored. Tolkien says this. He says that we're sub-creators. And so I just turn that into authorship, because how does God create? Well, he speaks. How does an author create? Well, he or she writes or speaks, right? And uses words to create worlds. So I think that disanalogy is important because we don't want to project onto God. But I think when rightly understood and looking from the scriptural phenomena, God is rightly seen as the original author. We author because he authored first. We are sub-authors. And insofar as someone's a good author, they're representing God well. That's awesome. They're showing God's creativity. They're showing a consistent worldview, or a consistent world in their novel, in their story. I don't know that any of us can actually get a fully consistent one. But as we approach that, yeah, we're representing God well. We're being a good image bearer of God. And so, yeah, I would say that Francis Schaeffer talks a little bit about that, about God creating with time and space. And I think, yeah, that's great. So there is this analogy, but we would expect that because I'm not God.
Sure. I'm glad to hear you say what you said a moment ago, though, because for some time I've wondered if I could think of an activity in which humans could take part that is more analogous to what it is to be God than authoring a story, and I'm not sure that there is one. So that's interesting. But another thought that occurred to me that I wanted to ask you about, even though I didn't mention it in advance, is that you've talked a couple of times already about the author-story relation in terms of words and pens and papers, and of course you don't mean those literally, but nevertheless it does seem as if the analogy that you're talking about is the actual process of creating the world of the story in the authorship process. But as you'll recall from my discussion with Braxton and from the video before that, when I'm thinking about the analogy, I'm talking about the world that exists, say, within Tolkien's mind, at some point after the writing process has taken place. And in fact, had he never actually put pen to paper, he could have still had the Middle Earth and all of its peculiarities all in place up until the moment he died, without ever actually having written anything, without actually having penned a dialogue, for example. And so I'm just curious, do you have any thoughts on whether maybe it doesn't even matter, the distinction that I'm trying to highlight here. But if it does, why might you think it does? And which of those two kinds of which of those two variants of the analogy do you think is the one that we're really trying to key in on here?
Yeah, I think it does matter, and this is something that Dr. Feinberg brought up today. I hope he's cool with me saying this. I think he will be, but he has done a lot of work on the divine decree, and some people will get confused and say the divine decree acts like an agent. It's like this other thing outside of God, and no, it's not. It's Dr. Feinberg talks about the divine decree as like a blueprint. It's a blueprint for a building. He's an architect, or whatever. So this is another analogy, and we can debate on how strong it is or not. But so I like that. I think that the story in God's mind is like the divine decree. God has eternally conceived of it, right? But I don't want to say God is eternally creating. So I want to say that there was a point where God created, but it wasn't like a brand new story that he thought of. So I would say that the divine decree is the God's conception of the story in his mind, and then he spoke he spoke existence into being. God said, and it was. God breathed. Psalms talks about God breathing out the stars, and it's really this poetic language. He said, and there were stars. God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And so, I want to say that he did speak out existence, because I want to affirm the creator-creature distinction. Mm-hmm. And I'm worried that if we just have it as a conception in the mind without the actual, we would say writing or whatever, but when it comes to God, he spoke it. And I want to say that creation has its own separate existence, to kind of avoid some panentheism concerns, that we just exist in the mind of God, that reality is God, but God is more than reality, right? So I think it's important to say that the story of reality was in God's mind eternally, that he had that as a conception. But I do think it is also important that Genesis 1 is right. Yeah. He spoke it, and that the world has its own existence, though it's not existent without him continually preserving creation.
Maybe there's a little bit more work to do here then, because my struggle with some of the conceptions that you're talking about is that, there are a few concerns I have. Firstly, yes, in writing the story on paper or typing it out on a computer or whatever, the author is bringing the blueprint to life, as it were. But the process of writing, which you've sort of made analogous to God speaking into existence, God's words creating are, at least ostensibly, according to Genesis, spoken in the cosmos he's creating. Right. When Adam hears the footsteps of God in the garden after he and Eve have sinned, he's not hearing the footsteps of God outside the story, right? He's hearing the footsteps of God inside the story, the very inside of which God's creative process takes place. And so that's one concern I have. And then the other concern I have is that if the writing into existence is or if that's analogous to the actual process of creating, then it seems as if the creating is happening while the writing is taking place, like as the pen is moving across the page. But the thing is, there's nothing actually being created. I mean, what's actually being created in the analogy is a piece of paper with writing on it. Right?
Yeah.
And that's just a record of the world that the author has constructed. And so I have that concern as well. I'll let you have the final word on this before we move on to the next question I have for you. But those are some things I'd like to see fleshed out a little bit more before I land too comfortably on one variant of the analogy or another.
Yeah, no, I think those are good points. I think that's why it's important to have the divine decree, the story being decreed. Especially, this is why it's a Calvinistic analogy. It's not open. It's not an open universe. God's practicing meticulous providence, but in writing, like you said, you're creating a record of it. And so this is where we get to have fun with analogy and say, yeah, there is. It's not in the exact univocal sense, so we don't have to say that it is exactly the same way that this process is being fleshed out in the same manner, exact same univocal fashion as when Tolkien writes or anything like that. So I would want to continue to preempt the panentheism that we. Or idealism. Maybe you're more comfortable with that.
I think that is probably the direction I'm starting to incline, just as a result of thinking through God as author.
Yeah, sure.
Just
Yeah,
to
and
be
that makes
clear,
sense.
though,
It sounds like it.
just for viewers' sake that might not be familiar with what you mean by idealism, we're not here talking about idealism as a hermeneutical approach to the Book of Revelation. That's a different kind of idealism. We're talking
Mhm.
about metaphysical idealism, that at the root of everything, at the foundation of everything, is mind, and that whatever we call physical is sort of like an expression or manifestation of mind. Um, and and uh, and I am kind of inclined in that direction precisely because of the analogy.
Mhm.
So I don't know. Are there important and critical differences between idealism and panentheism, or do you think that there's a significant degree to which they overlap or something?
Yeah, it depends on who you ask, right? So there's all sorts of types of idealism. There's personal idealism, absolute idealism. There's various forms of Christian idealism as well. There's different forms of panentheism. So someone out there is gonna, if I were to say no, there's pretty much the same thing, they would lose their minds. So yeah, there's significant differences. Some are closer to orthodoxy than others are, obviously, absolutely with most things, but yeah, yeah. So I would say that there's a difference there. What I'm wanting to say is that I want to affirm that God had this plan from eternity past, but in speaking, He's actually giving it its own unique existence, which He continues to uphold. So there's no universe out there without His preservation. He continues to do that, absolutely, and nothing that happens in the novel, we could call it the novel, the world. Nothing is going to happen there that's different than the divine decree, his conception of the story in his mind. But I do like that creator creature distinction. I think that, like you said, speaking into the void, sometimes we say creation out of nothing, but it might be more appropriately called creation into nothing,
Mm-hmm.
right? So God's speaking into, right? So there's only existence where God has spoken. But yeah, that it's an important point, and yeah, maybe we could ponder on that one some more and come back. But yeah, I understand where you're coming from. It makes sense that you would be tending more towards that direction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, in any event, we'll keep moving forward then. And, I first began thinking about the relationship between God and creation as something like the relationship between the author of a story and his or her story several years ago in the context of the debate between theological determinists like me and my non-Calvinist brothers and sisters in Christ. Because it seemed to me, and still seems to me, to resolve many of the popular objections to theological determinism that, and I'm saying that objections to theological determinism, they just say they very often will just say objections to determinism full stop, failing to make the distinction between causal or naturalistic determinism and theological one. But anyway, so this was something I came up with on my own a few years ago, but as I was delighted to see that this was not at all something new to me, that it was, I wasn't the first one to come up with it. But nevertheless, prior to that point and since, I've rarely, if ever, heard that analogy used in any Christian circles. And so I guess I've had sort of the impression that this was a fairly unpopular analogy, and that it hasn't been popular throughout church history. But in your second chapter, you push back against that assessment. You argue that the analogy has, in fact, been fairly popular, if only in a nascent or inchoate form, up at least until the modern era. So explain that for us, and what sorts of nascent forms of this analogy do we see in church history, and why is it that further development of the analogy wasn't really possible until the modern era?
Yeah, yeah. So, like you, I thought, well, and I raised this question in my thesis too. I say, if this is such a good analogy, if this is such a good tool for thinking about God, why isn't it just so commonplace that a master's thesis on it would be completely boring? Like, why wouldn't this already be so foundational in God talk? And so I wanted to look into that a little bit more, and I'm really indebted to Frederick Christian Bauerschmidt. Where is he at? He's in Chicago here. I always forget the name of the school. I believe he's a Catholic theologian, but he talked about, he had this great article, God as Author, and I pull a lot from his work saying that this was nascent, like you said, or inchoate, not completed throughout church history, and we hear it in the book of nature. You hear this all the time in old school theologians. We talk about God's two books, is it the Bible and the book of nature, and that's another way of describing general revelation. And so it's like I thought, why are people so cool talking about the book of nature, but not God as author, then it seems like a immediate just correlation. Just do that. Just say that if that's the book of nature, then God is the author of the book of nature. He's an author.
That seems pretty logical.
And so, exactly right. So Bauerschmidt says that it actually has to do with the conception of literature, with the conception of the novel, and that conception of the novel influences our view of the author. And so he makes this argument that prior to the modern era, in the medieval period, in the early medieval period at least, when they first started having books, people would, it was like copy and paste theology. So Peter Lombard takes all his sentences, and he's taking all these different pieces from different theologies, and he's putting them together. And everyone doing their dissertation back in the day to become a doctor of theology would have to write a commentary on Peter Lombard's sentences. So that was the big figure. And other than like Augustine or a couple other really fantastic writers, that it just wasn't that common. So Bauerschmidt argues that maybe if they would have started doing that back then, they would have thought of Aristotle as prime mover. That someone who takes pre-existing matter, right? For Aristotle, the universe is pre-existing, and just kind of reforming things, the unmoved mover. And so that actually would have been an inappropriate analogy for God. And so what we needed was a more modern conception of the novel, which came in the modern era. And with that new conception of a fictional world that's generally systematic, that makes sense, that has a good storyline to it. With that came this idea of the author as a genius. Like, wow, that author is fantastic. What a work of ingenuity. What a genius that guy is. And so now in this modern era, we do have that in place, and we have lots of great authors. We have lots of great systematic novels which draw you into a new world, created world, but a new world. And so with these two conceptions now, we can make more sense of the book of nature being a novel, and the God being this creative genius author who penned the book of nature.
Yeah. Fascinating.
So then
stuff.
with that in mind, it would make sense that it wouldn't pop up for them.
Yeah. It would make sense that you would see creation likened unto a book, but not necessarily the other side of the coin, God compared to an author until the modern era. That's helpful. Now in this first chapter of your thesis, in which you or are we on to the second one now? The second chapter. So we're in your second chapter now, and in this chapter, you also offer a number of helpful ways. It's kind of similar, but much better than I did in my first episode in this series. Ways in which the analogy can be really helpful for thinking through aspects of theology. And I think that many of those ways are ways in which the analogy can be seen as fruitful even for non-Calvinists. You said a little bit ago that this is a Calvinist analogy, but I think there's a lot of value to it, even putting the determinism debate aside. So could you talk through what some of those seem to you to be, some of these ways in which, determinism aside, the analogy can bear a lot of fruit in theological thinking?
Yeah. So I did say this is a Calvinistic analogy, and that's particularly the one that we'll be expounding on more. That's Kevin Van Hooser's. I think generally it is more of a Calvinistic analogy. However, C.S. Lewis, not a Calvinist, and he uses it really, really well. And he's the one who first introduced me. So one is creation out of nothing, or into nothing, right? We talked about this. So I'll just read C.S. Lewis in Out of the Silent Planet. The first line of Out of the Silent Planet: it's, "The last drops of the thunder shower had hardly ceased falling when the pedestrian stuffed his map into his pocket, settled his pack more comfortably on his tired shoulders, and stepped out from the shelter of a large chestnut tree into the middle of the road." Okay, that's just the first sentence, but with that first sentence, C.S. Lewis created a world. Now there's a world. You got thunderstorms, you got drops of rain coming down, you got chestnut tree. C.S. Lewis spoke, and it was. C.S. Lewis used words, and it was. So this is a helpful conception of thinking about the how God is related to creation. How is it that God created? Well, in Genesis 1, we see that God creates with his words. In John 1, we see that God created with the Word, right? The second person of the Trinity. And so this is the causal joint. I think it's setting up the causal joint for creation, for how it is that God interacts with creation. But initially, God created out of nothing or into nothing with words. And I think that's a really fun one. That's a really interesting one to think about. Instead of God building up with some kind of clay or something that already pre-exists, that's not what we believe in. We don't believe in that. We believe that it came from God. Well, God's words come from his mind, and he speaks out. Another one is incarnation.
Yeah, this is a big one for me.
And you talked about this one. Yeah, this one's great. I love this one. C.S. Lewis notes this one. Dorothy Sayers notes this one as well. Dorothy Sayers is interesting because she characterizes the whole novel of history as God's autobiography. And it sounds kind of weird at first because you're like, well, autobiography, you're talking about like his birth. Well, it actually does talk about the birth of the Son of Man, but that the whole story revolves around God as the main character and God's interaction with God's people for God's purposes in order to reveal himself more fully to his people. And so I think that one's really good. I think that the incarnation is huge because well, this one's really, really cool, actually. So God speaks. We already talked about that. God speaks into the world. But then when the creator steps into creation, now we can see we have a model for the incarnation for how it is that Christ could be truly God and truly man. He's bound within the creation as a man. He took on this new nature of being a character in the story. All the while, he's still God. So C.S. Lewis, when he wrote himself into Out of the Silent Planet, spoiler alerts or whatever, at the end of the chapter, he wrote himself in there, but he's sitting back at Oxford. But he's still in the story as well? Yeah, because he's existing on two different levels of reality. And what he gives himself, as he writes himself a character, if he gave himself a limp in the story, that character would have a limp, even if C.S. Lewis doesn't have a limp in real life.
Right.
So it's a really helpful conception of a tricky doctrine that we have to affirm as Christians, but it's a really helpful conceptual tool of thinking literally about God in a way that breeds a little bit more explanatory understanding, which I think is great. So, yeah, John 1:10, he was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. I think that's perfect. That sounds like an author entering his story. Mm-hmm. He's holding all this thing together, and yet here he is as a baby, with Mary. It's amazing.
It is.
So there's another one.
It is amazing, and I love what I love is how well it captures what you talked about a little bit, which is how it makes it possible for the incarnate author to genuinely be part of the creation within the creation. And so the analogy I gave in my discussion with Braxton, I think, was that, imagine an author in our world creating a world of two-dimensional creatures. If the author writes himself into the story as a two-dimensional figure, that doesn't change the fact that he's a three-dimensional human being outside of his world. Right. And this can help us to answer what seem on the surface to be really challenging texts in Scripture. So, for example, when Jesus says that nobody knows the day or hour of my return, not even the Son, but only the Father, we can obviously there's some Trinitarian issues in there that we would have to flesh out, but in terms of God knowing something outside of time, but not knowing something inside of time where he's incarnated himself, that seems eminently plausible if the relationship between God and creation is something like an author in a story. So I think it's a really great model for capturing how the incarnation might work. I mean, just to continue to ramble a little bit, you might be aware, I don't know, that I debated a somewhat well-known Unitarian recently named Dale Tuggy. He's a philosopher and so-called biblical Unitarian, and the I think seemingly most powerful among his arguments, he really doesn't have any biblical ones. They're almost exclusively philosophical or logical. Are his arguments that you can't have a person like Christ who is both immortal as God and mortal as human. Those are mutually exclusive traits. Yeah. But we can easily say that outside of the created order, God is immortal, and inside of the created order, he's mortal. There's no logical contradiction there because the two worlds are not, their times don't overlap. At any given point within the story, if you were to ask, well, what time is it in God's world? The answer is, it is no time in God's world. He's outside of, there is no one-to-one correlation between the times. And so, anyway, I'm sort of rambling here, but...
No, that's good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
go
ahead.
Well, so Gavin Ortlund follows up on the same motif and wants to talk about the extra Calvinisticum, which probably shouldn't be called Calvinisticum because it predates Calvin, but that's that Christ is still fully God,
Yeah.
still truly God outside of his incarnation, which naturally comes up in this talk of incarnation. And Ortlund says this can really breed some unity between, well, the modern the more the old debate between Lutherans and Calvinists about Nestorianism and Eutychianism, that the Calvinists said the Lutherans are Eutychians, that they're blending Christ's nature, his two natures together, and the Lutherans are saying you guys have such a separation between the two natures of Christ that you're Nestorian, and so they're throwing the heretical names at each other, and and Gavin Ortlund's an awesome guy, and he uses some retrieval theology, armed with what he calls it a metaphor, but said he'd be willing to accept it as an analogy, and uses Tolkien and Middle Earth to do exactly what we've just been talking about. That the full, Christ can enter into the story as a human while still being God.
Yeah,
and it's awesome. It's amazing.
It is
and
awesome.
I think that really, it really makes sense of the world being a novel. And going back to Dorothy Sayers, that Christ was the whole goal of the whole story.
Right.
That it all was meant to culminate in Christ fully revealing himself, the author, to us.
Right. It's very beautiful, and it's very compelling, and I love that it enables us to affirm the genuine and limited humanity of Jesus, while at the same time not having to resort to something like kenosis to explain. We don't have to say that somehow the divine nature lost its divine attributes or something like that, which is incoherent to begin with, but rather he's fully divine outside of his created order, and inside he's fully human. I think it's pretty profound. But as we both have sort of intimated and explicitly said, this is, at least in the context of your thesis, a Calvinistic analogy. So how, beyond the areas that you've just mentioned, that we've just been discussing, how can this analogy help us uniquely as determinists to think about how God determines events in time without not directly causing them?
Yeah, and so for the Calvinists out there who have read like Wayne Grudem or John Frame's Systematic Theologies, I would say these two are the biggest proponents of this. Even then, though, it's only a couple pages devoted to it. But they talk about Shakespeare and Hamlet and the two different levels of reality. So I actually like sticking with Tolkien because, I don't know, I like Tolkien. So when you look at Smeagol, Smeagol becomes Gollum. And you say, well, how did that happen? Well, Smeagol was jealous of his cousin finding this ring, and in his heart, he started welling up jealousy and anger and rage, and turned into homicidal rage, and he killed his cousin. And then from there, he was driven out from the townspeople into the hills, and then with the ring poisoning his mind. All these things make sense within the story. But at another level, you could say, well, Tolkien made that happen. Why did Smeagol become Gollum? Because Tolkien wanted that to happen. Well, Tolkien's a real jerk then, dude. Let's go arrest him for all the murders that Smeagol performed. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Like, why would you do that? It's a different level of reality, and it doesn't make sense to hold the author responsible for what his character did intra-narratively within the story. So there's two different levels of reality at play, and there we get to have the beginnings of a good analogy for thinking through God's sovereignty and human freedom. God's concurrence, a form of or one of the three aspects of his providence. His concurrence is working along with the intentions and actions of his creatures to bring things about, and yet God not being morally culpable for the sins of his creatures. And that's a really important distinction that we need to make, that many non-Calvinists want to pin us on and say, well, if you're right, if there's theological determinism, then God, you're excusing sinners and blaming God. That's what Guillaume Bignon's book's all about, and he nailed it, because that's the objection always. Yep. You can't be held responsible for your sin. God made you. And what they're doing now is, I can't help being an Arminian. God made me this way. They love that one. It's just this knockdown argument against us. Yeah. It's
really annoying. I hear it all the time, and there's some people in particular who seem to drop it into every single conversation. And
yep.
It's frustrating beyond belief, but this really gets to that distinction I mentioned earlier between theological determinism on the one hand and naturalistic or causal determinism on the other. And so often when I say, look, theological determinism is not, or theistic determinism is not the same thing as causal determinism. It is possible for a theistic determinist to also be a causal determinist, but they're not one and the same. So when people think about causal determinism, I think what they think of is something like a series of dominoes, right? So God tips over the first domino, but then from then on, every single domino falls simply because the domino preceding it tipped it over. And naturalistic determinism, causal determinism, is very much like this in the sense that no matter, every decision a person makes is itself the effect of a cause that preceded it in time.
Right.
And very often our critics will liken God in Calvinism to like a puppeteer or the programmer of a robot, because a puppet's arm doesn't simply moves because the puppeteer pulls the string, and the robot acts simply because it's been programmed to do so. But what you've just said is that in this kind of relationship, the relationship between an author and a story, yes, it's true that there is a sense, and we'll get to distinctions between kinds of causations a little bit later, there is a sense in which God causes the characters to do what they do in the sense that he has predetermined it, foreordained it. But that decision doesn't arise solely in God and then isn't carried out mechanistically in time, resulting in the action, right? The decision to do something is also simultaneously, to the extent that we can use the word simultaneously when we're crossing worlds like this, simultaneously it arises within the will of the character. Yes, it's been determined, but it's not just a domino falling. There's no series of causes and effects that you could identify that irresistibly leads the character to do what they do, and yet they are irresistibly doing what they do by virtue of God's predetermining it. So I think that's really powerful. But, and here's where I want to start to get into the third chapter of your thesis, you argue that even though there is this difference between how God might predetermine things if he's like the author of a story versus how a puppeteer moves around a puppet, nevertheless, you do contend in this third chapter that there are only some models of authorship as an analogy that are consistent with creaturely freedom and responsibility. And so in this third chapter, this is going to be fascinating. I'm not sure I could fully grasp it when I was reading it, so I'm hoping you can help me to understand this after I finish the question, which is proving to be very lengthy. But you look in this third chapter at two competing models of authorship and their strengths and weaknesses. One of them you call monologism or monologism. I don't know how you would pronounce that right. And the other is polyphonic dialogism. And you represent these two competing models using the authors Leo Tolstoy and Fyodor Dostoevsky, respectively. So before we start to talk about the strengths and weaknesses of these, in their ability to preserve the freedom and responsibility of creatures, tell us what these two models of authorship are, what makes them different from one another, and why do those authors, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, why do they illustrate these models well?
Yeah. And so I don't want to give the impression that these are mine, so I'm pulling these from Dr. Van Hooser's book, Remythologizing Theology. And so this is the part of my master's thesis where I'm trying to represent his view in order to advance it further, but I'm trying to get it right, and he said I did, so that was great. So he's pulling from Mikhail Bakhtin, who is wrestling with Dostoevsky's poetics and trying to understand Dostoevsky as an author. And so he puts him in conversation with Tolstoy, so two Russian authors, and he makes this distinction between monologism or monologism, one logos, right? One voice, one word, one thing coming through, and polyphony, poly, many, phony, and noise, right? So you have polyphony and you have monologic. And so in a monological authorship situation like Tolstoy, who's a very strong author who has a point to make, and he's going to do it through his characters. And so what Van Hooser does in following Bakhtin is he says, well, Tolstoy's characters are a little bit one-dimensional. And that's not to say anything against him as an author. He's a great author, but he's very domineering over his characters, and he's so sovereign that they don't come off the page. They don't have their own personality. They don't have their own. They don't have a will of their own, so to speak.
Which makes them almost a little unbelievable, right? You can't really relate because there doesn't seem to be a connection between the character's, the character's character and the actions of the character. It just seems like it's Tolstoy coming through. Is that what you're saying?
It's Tolstoy, exactly. It's Tolstoy coming through, and maybe it's still great because Tolstoy's a good author, but it's Tolstoy. It's Tolstoy behind this character's mask, and now behind this one, and there's no character of their own there, and so that's what they distinguish as monologism: one word, one voice, one speech. Okay, so then we have a polyphony. We have polyphonic authorship. And here's where Van Hooser says there's multiple interpretations of Bakhtin. There's a left wing, which is a radical polyphony, and this is that there's so many voices going on. The author has lowered himself into the story so much that he doesn't have sovereign control anymore. And you get a cacophony of voices. You don't have one major one coming through. The author is no longer sovereign over his story, and it's a big mess. And this might be like, if we're going to relate it back to theology, this might be like process theism, that God has entered in and he has emptied himself. We talked about that a little bit earlier. He's emptied himself so much to no longer really be sovereign God any longer. Yeah. And then there's dialogical authorship, dialogical polyphonic authorship. And I know you guys, it's crazy language. This is more continental philosophy. So anyone interested in philosophy knows there's this divide between analytic, which is rigorous logic, and continental, which is more flowery language. It's still good, even though it's continental. But so dialogic polyphonic authorship is a right-wing interpretation. It's more conservative interpretation of Bakhtin's analysis of Dostoevsky. But in dialogical polyphonic authorship, the author has genuine relation with his character. His characters actually have a character of their own, but the author remains sovereign even while he's not bulldozing over and forcing his will on his characters. And so here we see dialogues, right? So we see Plato's dialogues. Each one of the characters represents a different idea, and so they come to life. It's not just Plato hiding behind there. You don't get that sense when you're reading it. No, this guy actually has an opinion, and Euthyphro is Euthyphro. Like, I know Euthyphro. I've read that story again and again. He's different than Socrates. And it's not just this game of hiding behind. No, because they represent what Bakhtin calls voice ideas, because they represent these ideas, they have a genuine will of their own. They have a genuine existence because it's an idea. There's combating ideas going on. And so in relating God to an author, I think this is the best model, and so does Van Hooser. I think that because of Van Hooser, but in weighing the options, I think this is the best one as well, because it shows that we are like these voice ideas. We represent ideas, and we interact with each other through dialogue, and God created the universe through through speech, and then he consummates our personalities and our relationship with him through speech, through his innovelated word, right? Through the Bible, through the call and internal testimony of the Holy Spirit, the Spirit testifying to our spirits that we are children of God, divine illumination, he's opening up our minds, and persuasion. He uses you, he uses me, he uses different people in our lives with different messages to form our character and form our being. And so I think that middle one of dialogical authorship, that the author has entered into his story and he's dialoguing with genuine agents, he's still bringing about his will, but he's doing it through their own capacities, through their own minds. He's reasoning with them. He's illuminating them. He's not forcing his will on them. And I think if he were to do that, that would mess with your freedom. I don't think you'd be morally culpable if it was a Tolstoyan reality. I don't think we would be morally responsible. Yeah. So I think that's one that we shouldn't use, that type of authorship.
So we might say that, like, on one end of the spectrum, we've got something like a Tolstoy who has so much sovereignty that there is no realistic characters in the story that are relatable and seem to have a character of their own. And then at the other spectrum, you might have something like a Stephen King, maybe, because from what I understand, Stephen King claims that he more like observes the story as it comes comes to light before him, and then he just records it.
That's great. Yeah.
So there, the author doesn't really have any sovereignty. He's just recording what he sees. We want something somewhere in between those extremes, where you've got the sovereignty, that there is no action that takes place that isn't outside of the predetermining will of the author, but at the same time, they are genuine characters that seem to have characters and lives of their own. And by the way, one thing I love that just occurred to me, in fact, I think you might have mentioned this in the thesis. You'll have to tell me if I'm wrong. But I like how this helps also to understand the difference between miracles and just the way things normally operate. Yeah. Because we might think of a miracle, insofar as it's like a violation of the natural laws of physics or whatever, as something like a deus ex machina, right? Where there needs to be a solution to a problem, and it just boom, it happens in the story, and there's no real logical, nothing logical leads to it. It just happens. Well, that's kind of like God parting the Red Sea through Moses, or something along those lines. The resurrection, right? Of Christ. There wasn't anything in the laws of physics that nothing in the coherent story of the world that led to the resurrection of Christ. That was God. That was God's deus ex machina, right? Just resurrecting Christ supernaturally and miraculously, and so I think that's pretty cool.
Yeah. Oh, can I address that real quick? So usually we don't want to say Deus ex machina, because we want to say that's what happens with bad authors, right? Bad authors have to concoct, but God's a great author; he doesn't have to do that. But on a dialogical view of authorship, God is a character in the story as well, not just in Jesus Christ, but we see God speaking out of a bush.
Right.
We see God, but most of the times God is still using language to do that. And when these miracles occur, it's as if he's giving the authorship authority to his other characters. So Moses has the authority to part the Red Sea. Moses has the Jesus calms the storm by his words, right? So he says, "Be still," and the whole storm is still. So it's not in every single case that this is happening, but it's interesting that a lot of these miracles are happening through words. It's like the little in The Sims, that little thing that goes over your head. Yeah. Right. So now you have the power of the author, right? God is granting you that your words to actually do things. Van Hooser would say our words always do things, but to do miraculous things, metaphysical things, which is really interesting. So the Deus ex machina that you're talking about is a good thing, but we would still say that's been part of the ordained plan as well, and it makes sense within the story, even if it doesn't make sense within the laws of physics of the story.
Yes. No, and that's a really good point, and I also like how you brought out that when we talk about God as author, we're not talking about him solely, and when we talk about him writing himself into the story, we're not solely talking about incarnation, we're talking about also theophany, right? And just the in-time operation of God in time. It's just that's not where he naturally exists. He exists outside of the story, where he's written the story. But nevertheless, he's active. I mean, like I said a moment ago, his footsteps are heard by Adam in the garden.
Right.
But yeah, that was helpful. Okay, so then with that contrast in mind, between sort of the monologic authorship versus the polyphonic dialogic one, where does the monologic authorship falter, and where does the polyphonic dialogism succeed when it comes to creaturely freedom and moral responsibility? And we've kind of already sort of hinted at that a little bit, but unpack that for us.
Yeah, and here's also another reason to be careful about Deus ex machina. So if God were to drop an idea into your head, and it doesn't, in free will literature, it's called historicism, or the historical condition for moral responsibility. If it doesn't make sense with your history, then in what sense is it really yours? If God's just dropping in here by divine intervention instead of interjection, instead of interjecting with a word in order to convince you and use the God-given mechanisms of your rational capacities, if you were to just plant one in there, it seems like that would kind of mess with your moral responsibility. And so in a monological authorship model, well, first, we already talked about how it's really hard to get off the ground and have characters at all. But if God is just running roughshod over you, giving you these ideas, it seems like those are God's ideas. And I think that if that's the case, then God might be morally responsible for all the things you do, because he's giving you these ideas through bypassing your rational capacities. So I don't think that's actually really like your idea. On dialogical, what you can call it, Van Hooser calls it dialogical determinism. God has already determined that I will do A, B, and C, but the mechanism by which he's determined it is different than the monological. In this one, God is getting me to do that, not through manipulation, but through persuasion. So if it's a good thing, we would want to attribute that to God. I do believe there's asymmetry because God can't tempt someone with evil. Neither is he tempted by evil. But he can use secondary agents like the devil, who can dialogue with me, who can, whisper in my ear, who can tempt me with different things and give me a reason, add intranarratively within the story, intramundane reasons, as philosophers say, to do these things. So if somehow my capacities are bypassed, I would say I'm not morally responsible for that. But if my capacities are used and I'm reasoning and I get a reason to do this and I want to do it and I act on that, even if I'm determined to do that, I'm still morally responsible for doing that. And we could talk about different not Gettier, that's epistemology, Frankfurt cases and stuff like that if we wanted to talk about moral responsibility even with determinism. But this model is awesome because it provides a way for us to be determined, but determined through rational processes which make our reasons our own, even if they're evil reasons. There's an asymmetry again between God's not giving you evil reasons, but he does use secondary means, or he allows you to do the evil that you want, or he confronts you with his goodness. And in your natural, right? But in your sinful desires, I would say it's not natural, but we're born with sinful desires, but it wasn't originally like that, right? So that's why I want to say It's unnatural. So I'm born with these sinful desires. God doesn't have to illuminate me. He doesn't have to do that. But in presenting his goodness to me, like he did to Pharaoh, in presenting mercy to him, hey, look, the frog god's not God. The river god's not God. And continually, mercifully showing that he's God and they're not, he's actually hardening Pharaoh's heart, because each time Pharaoh says, no, 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 no. And each time he's being more and more consummated in his hard-heartedness. God's continually hardening even through this process of showing him mercy.
I see.
Yeah,
that's really good. So then when we could say that to the extent that Middle Earth is analogous to Earth and the cosmos that contains it, Saruman isn't, Tolkien doesn't like suddenly drop a thought from out of the blue into Saruman's mind to create the Uruk-hai, right? So, right. Saruman has a whole bunch of reasons that are consistent with his desires and his motivations and everything for creating the Uruk-hai, and so we can speak of it as being his decision, although it is also equally God's decision, Tolkien's decision, having written him to write it that way. So I think that's helpful. That brings us then to chapter 4 of your thesis. And here I want to go back to Guillaume Bignon, who you've mentioned a couple of times and who is mentioned a few times in your thesis. You've already mentioned the name of the book that he's got published that I'm a big fan of, called Excusing Sinners and Blaming God. That title captures two categories of objections that we as Calvinists often face. And the phrase excusing sinners is largely the one that we've been talking about so far. It captures the objection that if the actions of human beings are predetermined, then they can't be held morally accountable. And we've discussed how a robust authorship model might answer that. But the other phrase within that title, blaming God, captures a different objection, namely that if the actions of human beings are predetermined by God, then even if we could say that that sinners are responsible for their sins, nevertheless, equally, we could blame God for evil, having been the one to write it. In fact, the God as author analogy might seem to exacerbate this challenge rather than seem to alleviate it, because the objection is often offered in terms like determinism makes God out to be the author of evil, and of course here we are talking about God as an author. Now this is this is the objection that you tackle in chapter 4, and to get us started with this, the response to this. tackling the challenge, as you explain in this chapter, requires a precision that isn't already there in the challenge itself. The challenge that determinism makes God out to be the author of evil. And the reason why I say the precision isn't already there is because there seem to be at least two ways in which God might be said to author evil, one of which might not be morally objectionable, even if the other one is morally objectionable, or would make God out to be morally objectionable. So explain this distinction for us, and help us to make the challenge of God as the author of evil in theological determinism, help that challenge to be a little bit more precise.
Yeah. So the precision comes from James Anderson in his chapter in Calvinism and the Problem of Evil. I think it's Adam and the First Sin, maybe something like that. And he talks about it as well as Hugh McCann in Creation and the Sovereignty of God. And they both talk about how, and I'm not sure if I agree with them completely here. I think I probably do, but they say, well, if you mean, okay, God is an author and there's evil in the story, then yeah, in that sense he authored evil, but he's not morally culpable for it. He's not morally responsible. So there's at least two senses. One is authoring evil such that you're responsible for it and it's your fault. You're morally, it's morally objectionable that you would author it that way. And then author in a thin sense, that just you created the story in which there is evil. And so, yeah, you're an author in that sense, but we're not holding you morally culpable. It's not wrong. So that would be like Tolkien is the author of Smeagol's evil, even though we don't rightly hold Tolkien accountable for Smeagol's actions. And some of that is just alleviated by the authorial analogy, but I think more of that is alleviated in our case with God through dialogism, because God interacts with the novel of reality in a different manner than Tolkien does. Tolkien isn't entering in, and he's not hardening Smeagol's heart by offering him grace, right? But God does do that, and so this is why it's so interesting too that God's a better author than us. He authors in a different way than we do in this dialogical manner, which it's like Plato's dialogues. It's ironically like Hume's dialogues concerning natural reason, if he is Philo, if he is that character, which is interesting because he's arguing against God. But yeah, so God is the better author, and we are good authors insofar as we author like God, that we're representing, that we're imaging God in our creativity. So the objection comes through like self-defeat. That's one that people have talked about a lot with Calvinism, that if you're determined to have the beliefs that you do, then you can't have any warrant for them, or you can't be justified in those beliefs because you were forced to have them anyways. And that's a really weird objection. And actually, Richard Swinburne argues against that. The free willer of free willers himself says that doesn't lead to epistemic self-defeat, because you could be determined by rational processes to come to those beliefs. And if you were, it doesn't matter if you were predetermined, predestined, preordained to come to that belief, because the processes, the mechanism by which you come to that belief is through your reason. And so that's great. It doesn't end there, though. It can get even worse. So Jim Smeagol, a great philosopher, I love this guy. He's been on my podcast before. He wrote this great book called The Epistemological Skyhook. It's basically an adaptation of C.S. Lewis's argument from reason against naturalistic determinism, naturalism, and determinism simplicator just generally. And so he actually tries to argue this against theological determinism and says, okay, fine. God may have predestined you to use your rational faculties in order to come to the beliefs that you hold. Cool. But in order for you to be justified in your beliefs, you have to have a good explanation for you have to have an explanation for your belief. And this is what we talked about with the story. You have to have a historical condition. It has to be an explanation. It can't be Deus ex machina. Smeagol just can't randomly out of nowhere be a great guy and then become some raging murderer. Yeah. It doesn't make sense in the story. So it has to be an explanation for the belief. It has to be a good explanation, right? God's a good author. It can't just be out of nowhere. It can't be a weak one that he stubbed his toe one day and then wanted to become a murderer. That's not a good explanation. And here's the rub here. It has to be your explanation. So even if God has predestined you to form a rational belief through your processes, if God's the one making you do that, then it seems like that's God's reason and not yours. That's God's explanation for the belief, right, not yours. And if it is, then the culpability transfers back to God. So it's God's fault that you had this belief, even if it's rationally justified, because you used a reason to form it. God made you do that. And so all the evil, wicked stuff that you do, all your pro attitudes, meaning like your beliefs, your desires, and then your actions on those pro-attitudes, those beliefs and desires, all that culpability traces right back to God. And so here I use mechanism, ownership, and reasons responsiveness, some modern theories in the philosophy of free will that says you can be determined to have these beliefs, but as long as the mechanism by which you form those wasn't overridden, then it's still your belief. So by God presenting something to you and reasoning with you through Scripture, through the internal witness of the Holy Spirit, through illumination, God's not overriding. He's not manipulating you. If he put a chip in your brain, yeah, it would override your mechanism and you wouldn't have that anymore, even if your reason's responsive. But God made us to be reasons responsive, to respond to the reasons in our history which shape and form us. And he doesn't ever manipulate. He doesn't go in there and take control. He doesn't own our capacities, but he presents things to us and shapes us. And because he's God and because he's the author of the story, he can do that in such a way to bring about the desired result without being a manipulator, because he knows what it would take to present to you the situation. He's been forming your process. He's been forming your character since you were born by putting you in situations, passively permitting things to happen, actively bringing about things through interjection, through the internal witness of the Holy Spirit, through your parents, through this guy who gave you a gospel track, all these different scenarios. And here's where Guillaume Bignon talks about a relevant difference between a manipulator and God, is that a manipulator has to take control of your ownership, your mechanism. They have to override your God-given characters, your God-given faculties in order to manipulate you. But God doesn't override your God-given faculties. He's God. He's the one forming you all the way throughout this whole process. So that's a really big difference between a manipulation case where a creature is manipulating another creature, and the case of theological determinism where God rightly is culminating this character in the person. And God's a good author, so he doesn't have to drop in ex machina beliefs that don't make sense within your schema there.
Sure. So, okay, so then going back to the objection and the precision and stuff, we want to make the problem with the phrase determinism makes God the author of evil is that to author sin in a morally objectionable sense would obviously be to be the one to do the evil, and we're not talking about him doing the evil. We're talking about him authoring a story which is done. And then when you start to talk about manipulation and coercion, then you also start to distinguish between ways in which determining things could make God morally objectionable versus ways in which it might not. Now, I like what you said there about manipulation and coercion, because I remember a couple of years ago, I think I was thinking about some of my complaints with my friend and fellow faculty at Trinity, Leighton Flowers. He in response to me saying his puppet and robot type analogies fall flat, he says, okay, well, just imagine a mad scientist gives somebody a potion and it changes them into what it is to think and feel the thoughts and feelings that the mad scientist wants them to do. And what I like is that you've captured that's exactly the kind of manipulation that we're saying is not the case with God as author, right? There's no there isn't anything happening in time that is suddenly and without seeming explanation just transforming a person's character or changing a person's decisions. It's all consistent with and flows naturally out of the kind of person that person has become over the course of his or her lifetime. And I think that makes a lot of sense. Were you about to chime in? I thought I saw you.
Yeah. So, and that's great. And I think Guillaume Bignon's kind of knocked a lot of those down in his first couple chapters of his book, Excusing Sinners, of the puppeteer and puppet strings, all those kind of arguments. The one case you might be thinking to yourself, the audience here, is, well, what about Paul on the road to Damascus? It seems like God kind of smacked him down and changed all of his attitudes and stuff like that. And I brought that up with Guillaume in our podcast, and one thing that came out was, well, if God did do that and overrid his ownership and his mechanisms here, then that would mean Paul's not morally responsible for the outcome. Well, what's the outcome? Salvation.
Yeah.
Well, we don't care. That's fine.
Yeah.
But Guillaume further added that it didn't happen in a vacuum, and he was interacting with these Christians the whole time. And so even there, it could be argued that that God was preparing him, that he was giving him reasons for it, and then that happened. So either way, that's not bad, because that's not an evil thing that happened. So this is an interesting footnote there.
Yeah. Before we get into the last set of questions I have for you, a thought just occurred to me, which is that somebody like Leighton Flowers is going to push back to this and say, okay, sure, God as an author could conceive of a story in which a character's character has formed such that, given the circumstances that the character is written into at any given point, the rational decision that character makes is to sin, right? But and so that takes away a lot of the sting of the manipulation, the coercion argument. But I wonder if Leighton Flowers and people like him would push back and say, okay, but that character itself, not the character, but the character's character, right? The character's disposition and feelings and desires and things. Those are part of the way that God has created the person. So how, which Leighton and somebody like him might say is just sort of kicking the can down the road a little bit, right? It's still God manipulating. It's just that he's manipulating by crafting the person's desires and character to be this or that, thereby guaranteeing the sinful outcome that he's predetermining. So how would you respond to that kind of objection before we start to close in on your last chapter?
Yeah, again, I'd want to point to the asymmetry between good and evil. So God has taken this active role in the good things that we do. But we can't attribute any evil to him. God's not tempted by it and by sin, and he can't tempt to sin. He can use secondary agents, but the whole mechanism is the whole point. So if God were to predetermine it in a way that's divine intervention, that he's forcing us, and where it doesn't fit with our character, that's totally wrong. Yeah, that's totally bad. I don't like that at all. But so you're saying, so the objection might be, well, he's still manipulating this person into this. Well, in what way? So how is it, I guess they'd have to explain how it's manipulative if it's consummating their nature instead of going against their nature. So how is your nature formed? I think a libertarian would want to say a similar thing to us, that our natures are formed through interactions with people, through interactions with our dog, through all sorts of things that we interact with in this story. Not ad intra, but intra-narratively or intra-mundane, if you don't want to consider this a novel. That's how we're formed, by reacting to different things. And so there's one aspect where you look from the individual, and you can never say, I really want to do this, but God's making me do that. No, you have reasons, and you're acting out of your reasons. Even when you're being mugged, I don't think you're going against your reasons. I don't want to give you my wallet, but I also don't want to get shot in the head.
Right.
And so I have this hierarchy of desires that I'm choosing out of. And those desires were formed throughout my whole history of life.
Right.
And so even if I was determined to give this guy my wallet, I still had my reasons. It was still my explanation for my beliefs that I acted on. And so there's an asymmetry in that I would say that God allows us to continue to form evil desires and sinful desires. God's not putting those in there, but he's allowing it through our interactions, and he's allowing it through the devil tempting us. And who knows what that looks like, and if it's ever really the devil who's tempting me. Maybe he's worried more about the president, or because he's not omnipresent, so maybe it's just a lesser demon. I know there's a whole demonology if you want a hierarchy thing, but God is allowing us to form evil characters, and he's hardening us in certain aspects, because we want to say as Calvinists that God does harden people's hearts. But I think this is also really helpful for thinking through how God could harden someone's heart and still be good.
Yeah.
Well, he's hardening them by presenting his goodness to them, but not illuminating them through illumination, or through granting them understanding, or interacting with them in a way that would bring about salvation. And some people are going to hear that and go, well, if God could do this, then he could save everyone, and yet he doesn't. And I say, yeah, that's right. I believe that. God doesn't save everyone. I think God could if he wanted to, but that's not the story he's telling.
Right.
He's telling the story where the culmination is Christ and then the eschaton, but he's also demonstrating his wrath on sinners. He hates sin. And I deserve that wrath, but he poured that out on Christ instead. Why did he pick me instead of my cousin? Why did he pick? I don't know, man. I don't know. I don't have the mind of the maker here. I don't know. intra-narratively, I might be able to give some reason, but I'm very, very hesitant to do that because he could pick anyone he wants because he's in control.
That's right.
So, yeah, it makes sense within the story, but he could have easily not written me at all or written me a different character or just allowed me on the disgusting path I was on.
Right. Yeah, so there's a couple of things that you said there that I'm going to pick up on in the last couple of questions I have for you in a moment, but just to sort of put some flesh on the bones that you just set up, we could say that the reason why the mad scientist and potion analogy that Leighton Flowers wants to use is the reason why that fails is because to go back to the Tolkien analogy, Tolkien didn't have Saruman, unbeknownst to himself, drink some potion and suddenly he becomes the wicked wizard Saruman, in service to Sauron. Right. Saruman, whatever kind of race the wizards are, I mean, they look human, but they seem to be their own race. I don't know what that is, but anyway, he was presumably conceived and born as one of this race with whatever sort of nascent personality a zygote might have when it's first developing. But its character that becomes the Saruman we encounter is something that develops over the course of Saruman's lifetime as a result of the interactions that Saruman has prenatally, postnatally, in childhood and so forth with the world around him. And that's why the analogy that the potion and mad scientist thing doesn't hold up. And what I like too about, you mentioned how the hardening might be conceived of, I think one could make the argument that when Gandalf goes to Saruman to try to convince him not to serve Sauron in the way that he wants to do, one could make the argument that by pleading with Saruman in that way, Gandalf is actually hardening Saruman's heart.
Yeah.
Right? In a way that would not make Gandalf, let alone Tolkien, responsible, morally culpable for the actions that Saruman ultimately decides to do as a result of his hardening. So I think that there's a lot of fruit to be born there. But I want to turn now, in the time we have remaining, to your fifth and final chapter of your thesis. There are two questions I want to ask you about it, and then we'll wrap up. And the first of these two questions, it follows naturally from a word that you used a couple of times in the course of our conversation, which is the word allows, or in your thesis you used the word permits. Because in discussing how a robust God as author analogy lends itself to a powerful theodicy, which you go on to do in this chapter, you several times say some things along the lines of God permits his creatures to sin, but he doesn't himself commit the sin. And that's very true. But I, even as a determinist, struggle to see how the word permit even makes sense here, or to use the word that you used in our conversation a moment ago, allows. Tolkien, he doesn't merely permit Saruman to create the Uruk-hai, right? Or so it seems to me. He ordains it. Even if Saruman autonomously desired to do so, even if Saruman had the desire to do so, it's not as if his desire was autonomous. Right? Tolkien authored the story in such a way that Saruman's desire is what Tolkien wrote to happen. So Tolkien authored, not merely permitted, Saruman to do what his desire was. And so before I ask a question about theodicy, which is something that you cover in this last thesis, can you help me and viewers to understand how it makes any sense to use the language of permission or allowing to say that God permits or allows evil in a theological determinism like ours?
Yeah, for sure. And this is something Calvin takes up as well in the Institutes, and my second chair, John Feinberg, takes up following Calvin and saying permission is kind of it's kind of squishy. It's a way to God's permitting. It's a way to try and get God off the hook. But then after Calvin, some more Reformed scholastics, I think Turretin uses permission as well. So permission doesn't have to be at odds with the divine decree. God decreed it, but how is it that the decree is brought about? So if we want to, the decree is over here. This is the plan that's going to happen. And here he's actively giving you a positive reason to do something. He's presenting it in such a way that he knows it'll be irresistible to you because he's presented it in this manner. He's given you illumination. Maybe it's your salvation. Maybe it's trust in Jesus. So he's actively playing that role, which is a different role that he plays when he is hardening your heart, or when he is not intervening, not interjecting in a situation where you're going to sin. And so in that case, he could have done it. He could have stopped you. He could have stopped me so many times from sinning. And when I first became a Calvinist, it was a big problem for me because I was such a wicked, vile sinner, and I had no control. And I was so angry at God. Why didn't you stop me from sinning? And I had to wrestle through that a lot. And my brother helped me a ton with that. That was great. But so there's a different role. There's the asymmetry that God plays when it comes to your sin and your good works. And so I wouldn't want to say God empowers you to do these good works, but he's not empowering you to sin. He's allowing you to sin. And it's what Calvin's getting at in wanting to get away from that allowing permission language is saying that God, it was somehow out of his control. No, it was still within God's control because he still has the power to interject whenever he wants. If he wanted to, he could have. It's not as if it was outside of his control, but he allowed you to continue on forming those wicked desires, those pro-attitudes, whatever it was. Never, I would say never without a greater good in mind, though. He always has a purpose for the evil that he allows. But we can't say that he's actively doing it. He's not doing the evil. If you want to say he's causing it through secondary means. He's causing it through maybe you being tempted, or you through the natural conditions that he's set up in the story for you to be influenced by this person and this person, right? And so that's what I'm trying to get at when I'm using language of allowance or permission that God could have, but he didn't interject and stop you from doing that.
Okay, so
what do you think about that? Is that making sense?
Well, I think it does. I don't think it's going to satisfy Calvinism's critics, but then again, I don't think much will, except for God himself. But I guess I think what I would want to say is that when we're talking about God permitting somebody in his world to do evil, as theological determinists, we are still saying he wrote that in the way that a character writes a story. It's not as if it's not as if the sinner autonomously decides to sin, and that wasn't what God had actually wrote to happen.
Exactly.
But the reason we can say that it's still permission is because in that world in which everything is sensible and coherent, that this person's character has developed in the way that it has over the course of his or her lifetime, and the circumstances present themselves in such a way that it makes sense that they choose to sin over not sinning. God is not intervening in all of that in some way. He's not stepping in and preventing this from happening and causing this to happen. It's the world and all of its parts that he has written to coherently work in the way that it does. It has produced the action that he has preordained. And so it's permission intranarratively, maybe we could say, but not extra. It's not from the outside. God isn't merely, Tolkien isn't merely permitting Saruman to create the Uruk-hai. He is... But from within the world, if he were within the world, he's letting things play out the way that one would expect them to, such that Saruman creates the Uruk-hai. So it's that inside the story permission we're talking about, right? Yeah,
and there's another helpful tool, but there's the thesis is kind of technical. It's not uber technical, but it's a little bit technical. It's a little bit hard to explain it all on a podcast. But Van Hooser distinguishes between three types of authorship. And authorship one is like theological determinism, theological authorship. God wrote the whole story. But then there's authorship 2 and 3. And authorship 2 is God as a character in the story interacting with his characters. And this is when he's bringing things about through his word. He's brought everything in authorship 1. He's brought everything about through his word, the whole story. This is the Tolkien outside. But then if Tolkien were to write himself into the story, like C.S. Lewis did, or like God does in the story of reality, this is authorship 2. This is where he's bringing things about actively, where all the stuff that he's not actively bringing about by authorship 2, but that he has sovereignly decreed in authorship 1, those are the sins. God's not actively responsible. He's not making anyone do anything against their wills or against the desires that are formed intranarratively. And then authorship 3 is like divine special revelation. It's like the Bible. So he's actually written a book within the book. Theophany is special revelation. But so particularly the Bible is a story within the story that's like a manuscript of the story. Mm-hmm. It's like telling you how you should play your part, how you should, and it actually functions to help you form different beliefs. I read the Bible and I say, oh, I should do this, I shouldn't do that, right? Or I should relate to God in this manner. So there's three types of authorship at play, and that's getting at what you were just talking about with being outside and being sovereign over it, decreeing, but then also we're not saying that God is actively causing the sin,
Right.
but he is permitting it. Yeah.
So to go back to that three types of authorship, we would say God is the author of sin in the first sense of authorship, the same way Tolkien authors the sins of Saruman.
Yeah.
But within the narrative, in which he is active, his authorship within that world is, in terms of that third kind, is only when it comes to things that aren't unrighteous, the actions of creation.
The second kind, authorship too.
Okay, the second kind then. So in that second kind, he is directly at work. He's appearing in theophany to people and inviting them to do things, or he's stepping in and putting scales over the eyes of Paul to ensure that he does what he has written him to do. That's the second kind. But in the third kind of causation or authorship, the author isn't actually in time intervening to cause somebody to do something. And we would say that when people sin, it's not that third kind of authorship taking place. God is, or it is that third kind, but it's not God doing it. It's God setting up the circumstances that naturally, within the coherent world he's created, lead to the person sinning. Is that kind of what we're saying?
Yeah, and this is another important concept to re-emphasize about voice ideas and stuff. So there is, if God wants to create this type of character will respond in this way in this scenario. And so it's not like an external constraint. This was a worry from Dr. Van Hooser and Feinberg. It's an external constraint that God is forced to do this or that. That might be more reminiscent of Molinism and what raises the grounding objection, right? That there's these, God has to play with the cards that he's dealt. Well,
to
this
use
is a little
a
bit
phrase
different.
that Molinist William Lane Craig has used.
Right. So no, here if God wants to create like a Judas, that's a particular type of person. Certain things are going to happen which give rise to him betraying the Lord. But he didn't. That's an explicit example of him being predetermined, predestined to do that. And yet he wasn't forced against his will. He wasn't like, man, I really love Jesus. Why is my will being turned in this direction? No, he actively wanted to, even if he had conflicting ideas and stuff. But he didn't have the freedom to do otherwise. Otherwise, we are not saved today. We don't have the resurrection. We don't have the crucifixion. And we don't have forgiveness of our sins. And so that God did not afford him principle of alternate possibilities. And yet he was free to do so because he had responded to the reasons, and he was the owner of the mechanism by which he formed his beliefs, and they were wicked beliefs, and he acted on them, and God brought about a greater good from that.
Well, and he foreordained that it would be done. But here we're talking about that third sense of authorship, not the second or first. Okay, last question before we start to wrap up. In this last chapter, I've already mentioned a little bit earlier that the thing that I want to focus on most in this last chapter is where you think this analogy can help us in theodicy, because you rightly observe that an author like God could have created heroes who freely choose to exercise their answerability in morally upright ways. So the question that naturally leads us to ask, or the question that we're naturally led to ask, is why did God choose to write a story with evil and sinful rebellion in it? We might even ask the question that you did a moment ago, which is, if God could have resulted in the salvation of everybody, why did he write a story in which only some, indeed possibly a minority, although that's another question, are in fact saved? And so my last question then is how, and here expand upon, or talk about how you answer this question in your 5th chapter, but how can a robust God as author analogy help determinists like you and me to explain why God, like the author of a drama, would predetermine his creatures to sin if he's the thrice holy God that we read about in Revelation, and in whose presence Isaiah became undone because he was so moved by the holiness of God? How does the analogy help us to understand why God might write a story, as he's done in reality, in which not all of his creatures act righteously all the time?
Yeah. And just acknowledging right off the bat, I learned this from Dr. Feinberg in his problem of evil class, that there's some real wickedness out in the world. Like, some of the listeners here have experienced it. Some of the listeners may have done some themselves. Children get leukemia. My nephew had it. Like, this is not a conversation I'm trying to have with someone in the midst of a crisis, right? So this is an academic discussion. It's still theologically important. It's absolutely important, and I would say it's important to get a grip on this when you're not in the cusp or in the grasp of tragedy, so that you have some ballast in your boat when the storm comes. So I really don't want to come off as callous, is what I'm saying. I don't want to say that this is just purely academic. I understand there's genuine suffering, there's evil that we've experienced that's wicked, that would really mess with our theology, and has for many of us. That's not the conversation that's about to take place, so just keep that in mind. So I borrow from Scott Christensen's new book, What About Evil? And he calls his theodicy a greater glory theodicy, and I really like that. That God's glory, and he's taking this approach from Alvin Plantinga. I forgot which book it's in, but it's the Felix Culpa defense. The Felix Culpa that Catholic churches talk about, the happy sin, and it's not like gleefully happy, but because of the fall we have incarnation and reconciliation. Because we've seen the depths of our depravity, we can see the height of Christ entering in, stepping down to our station, and lifting us back up out of the mire and muck. And so ultimately what I'm arguing is that I think Van Hooser's theodrama, this authorial analogy and God interacting with the world in this dramatic fashion, that this authorial analogy fashion, gives rise to this really good theodicy. I think it's a great theodicy. That why is there evil in the world? Well, because God wanted to tell a story where he's fully revealing his attributes, where he's not just revealing his goodness, but he's revealing his hatred for sin. He's revealing his justice. He's revealing his mercy. We don't get to see mercy without sin. We don't get to see sometimes people will make this weird metaphysical argument about evil, that like evil has to exist in order for us to see goodness. It's just wrong. Like, look at Genesis 1. They knew that God was good. He created things good. There was no evil yet. So we don't need that. But if God's going to tell the story that he wants to tell, it necessitates evil characters like Satan. It necessitates a fall in order for us to be lifted up from the fall. So why is there sin and evil in the world? Because God wanted to demonstrate his attributes. And you say, well, that seems like he's kind of a jerk. And you say, well, I think you kind of have the wrong perspective here, because you have, and this is a classic Calvinistic answer, and I don't want to be a jerk about it, but it seems like you have a little bit more of a man-centered approach, that God should be about making me happy. So, well, if you go with the Edwardian take, if God were to have you as the summum bonum, as the greatest good, then he'd be like an idolater. God has to have his glory as the greatest good, and it's actually the best for us. This is maybe John Piper. It's better for us that God does that. If God has himself as the greatest glory, and we're blessed through that, like that makes sense. We get to see God as being who he is, as being the summum bonum, the greatest good. God can't direct his glory at us. Like, we can't be the terminus of reality. It can't be all about us. And so what I want to argue is that there's evil in the world because God wants to demonstrate his love for us, and demonstrate his mercy towards us, and demonstrate his grace. And that's a better story than a story where there is no fall. And it's kind of a harsh answer to hear at first. But I think if you think through it, I think if you think through the biblical phenomena, if you think through God's omnipotence and his divine attributes and his plan, that this isn't plan B. God knew what was going to happen. Yeah. He knew that Adam and Eve were going to sin. Whatever view,
it didn't just know it. He wrote the story to happen that way.
Right. But even if you're an Arminian who holds to omniscience, you do affirm that God knew that this was going to happen, and he could have stopped that from happening. And so they say, well, no, because you needed this. God couldn't have taken that away because you needed this genuine challenge in order to have a free relationship. You needed to have that. But I want to argue that God knew the whole time and planned it. because I think it's much more theologically satisfying. I think it's more psychologically satisfying that God didn't roll the dice with our reality and say, well, it's a 50-50 shot. But rather that it was his plan the entire time to allow us to fall. He didn't actively make us fall, but to allow Satan to tempt Adam and Eve in order to bring about this greater good, which is the greatest good on the cross. And so then from looking at the cross, John Frame calls it the Christological greater good defense, a Christocentric greater good defense, I think, because we're looking at the cross as the greatest good. If God could take the worst evil in history, the God-man being crucified wrongfully, the only one who deserved not to die, being crucified, the author entering into the story and his characters murdering him, just butchering him in a egregious fashion. If God could take that worst evil, the worst possible evil, and bring the greatest good out of it, then of course he could do that with the evil that I experience in my life. And so, yes, God has ordained the evil that happens, but why do you ordain this particular evil? Why do you ordain that my nephew gets cancer? Hey, look, I don't know. This is called skeptical theism. I'd have to be omniscient to know all the reasons that God has for that. I know that he knows, and I've seen him do it with the worst evil. I've seen him do it with the cross. So I can trust his character. I can trust his authorial providence that if he can do it with the worst, then he can bring a greater good out of my nephew's leukemia. I don't know what that is. I'm not going to presume to tell you. There's a bunch of things that I've seen, but I'm not going to say this is the exact reason or these are the 100 reasons. I don't know. I don't know the full story. I don't know the plot. I'm not outside the story like God is. Right. But he is, and I can trust him because of the cross.
Yeah.
And he had preordained that to happen.
Yeah, I'm with you. I find that much more compelling than alternative theodicies. And in fact, in my debate book on predestination and providence, I argue that, or at least let me put it this way, I explain that for me, the thought that God might be allowing evil. He might have a greater good of libertarian free will in allowing evil to happen in the abstract, but when it comes to individual acts of evil, I don't find any solace in the thought that God permitted senseless evil to be done to me, and then he's just like an awesome judo master who's able to work good out of it, right? I find much more solace knowing that the very fact, that the very loss of my wife's and my 2 unborn children is something that God wrote into the story because of the good that he brings out of it. Yeah. I find much more solace in that, and I find the story, the theodicy that you just offered very compelling, but I just want to add one thing to it and see if you think there might be something to this, because I haven't heard anybody else put it in this way. I don't think that it's merely about us being able to see, to witness all of God's glory, attributes that we would never be able to see happen if it weren't for the reality of sin. I think it's also that God wants us as his creatures to emulate him. He wants us to be able to act in the way that he would act in the face of sin. So just as God's nature is to show, and he loves showing mercy to people that are suffering, so he wants his creatures to show mercy to people that are suffering. But that's impossible apart from the reality of sin and pain. And so do you think that on top of everything that you just said, we might also be able to say that God wrote a story that has sin in it so that his characters can experience some of the things, some of what it means to be like God in the face of sin?
Yeah, I think that's good. So in giving the Christ-centered, Christological, greater good theodicy, or narratival theodicy, and saying that Christ, ultimately it was his self-revelation that is the highest good. That's not incompatible with other ones like soul building, which I think was what you were getting at there. That God wants to build our souls into. It's like soul building with Imago Dei in there too, right? He wants to build our souls into and form the kind of character that represents him, that images him in the face of suffering.
But so just, I'll let you continue in just a moment. But I just want to be clear. Yeah. The reason why I don't see this as the soul building theodicy is because, look, Paul talks about how when we are raised from the dead and glorified, it's going to be like in the twinkling of an eye that we're transformed. There seems to be a profound sense in which God will transform our characters instantaneously when we're glorified in some real ways. And he could have made us like that from the beginning without the fall and sin and so forth. I'm not merely talking about building a soul that is like God. I'm talking about giving his creatures the opportunity to live out the imago Dei in the face of sin. Not just to merely be like God, but to act like God. And there are no ways to act like God in the face of sin without there being sin. That's kind of what I'm getting at. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it does. I could hear someone pushing back and saying, well, God was acting like God without sin for whatever you want to say, if it's
but he wasn't acting like God
or,
in the face of sin until there was sin for him to be in the face of.
Yeah, but so he didn't have to write the story with sin in it, and we could have still acted like God, but not acted like God in the face of sin. Yeah, I like it. I'm just trying to think of what people might.
Yeah.
I'm trying to preempt some stuff here. I like yours. So the soul building. I like that. I also like what you said about in an instant, like because Paul says that, right? But also we believe in a sovereign God who sovereignly wrote the story and calls us home at a particular time in our life for his own reason. And so maybe that's after a certain amount of experiences. He wanted us to have this, and this, and I don't think our memories are completely wiped or anything like that. I think that would be worse. I think that would like destroy the whole story, all that work that he did in our lives. But we see that in proper context at the end. And so being good Calvinists, we affirm that, yeah, God called us home precisely when he wanted, like Gandalf. Like we didn't show up in heaven early or late, but precisely when the Lord predetermined. And I think there is some soul building in there. He was sanctifying us to a certain point, and it's not like we got hit by a bus unbeknownst to God. Now he has to snap us. He has to correct all the rest of the sanctification process. No, he knew what he was doing. He called us home, and yeah, he's gonna complete us. I don't want to say I'm anywhere near completion. So if I died tomorrow, yeah, he's gonna have to snap a lot of sanctification in there. But I hear what you're saying. What I'm trying to get at is that God's glory, God's self-revelation, I think, is the pinnacle, as Craig talks about in his penal substitution. It's the center of the gem, it's the face of the gem, but there's all these different models of the not incarnation, the atonement. And so this I like that a lot. This would be like the central gem, the central face of the gem, and then there's lots of other defenses and theodicies that fit within the theodramatic greater glory, greater good theodicy.
Yeah, no, I like that. All right, well, we're coming up on that 2 hours that you and I said we could devote to this. So let's start to wrap up. I often like to give my guests an opportunity to share a parting message. I want to slightly adapt that a little bit and have you speak first to fellow determinists and then to our brothers and sisters in Christ who are critics of determinism. In speaking to determinists like me, my question for you is, are there any, what sorts of questions do you think are left to be explored? What sort of work is there left to be done in terms of the God as author analogy that you'd like to see determinists like me and Bignon and others do to further flesh out how this analogy can help us to conceive of the relationship between God and the creation that he has predetermined?
Yeah, so on the philosophical side, there's Al Mealy's zygote argument, and it comes, I forgot the goddess's name, but it makes this goddess who created this zygote and said in 20 years this zygote's going to kill somebody, and that it could present a unique challenge for the authorial analogy. And you were kind of hinting at this a little bit, and you even mentioned zygote. That's something that needs to be clarified more, and how there's disanalogy between Athena, let's call her, and Yahweh, and how they seem similar, and whether we need to flesh out whether that is manipulation, because Al Mealy doesn't say it's manipulation, but it seems like it's manipulation, that if she's predetermined this death to happen that the zygote will grow up and kill someone. It seems like it might be. So we need to flesh that one out. I think that's a pretty good challenge. I'm not a philosopher of free will, but I have some friends that are determinists, and they say it might be a challenge, but I think they can handle it. I want them to. So if they're listening, go ahead and handle that for us. That's a good one. For theological determinists, you don't have to be philosophers, but you should know what you're talking about, right? So for the folks at home, like a lot of times Calvinists sound like they're talking about monologic authorship, and they sound like they're a little bit like very, very hardcore because they want to affirm God's sovereignty. Amen and amen. I love that. But you do need to affirm that we are image bearers of God, that we are creatures with genuine freedom. And you need to know what you mean by that. When you say genuine freedom, a libertarian is going to say that's not genuine freedom. You need to have the principle of alternate possibility. You don't have to be a philosopher, but think through what you're saying when you're representing this position, and have some humility. Be able to say, hey, look, man, I'm coming at this theologically, and I'm trying to be honest with the text, and have some humility and say, I'm not sure about that. I don't know. Let me come back to you. Let me reason that through a little bit more. Hey, could you help me think through this? Instead of, well, if you're an Arminian, I have to destroy you. A lot of times you're doing us all a disservice by doing that, and you might end up misrepresenting the author, and making him responsible, genuinely making him responsible for sin and evil.
Yeah. Well said. Okay, now let's let you speak to the indeterminists or non-determinists that are watching. I again, as I think I mentioned earlier, I think there's a lot of fruitfulness. There's a lot of fruit to be borne by the God as author analogy, even apart from the determinism issue, areas especially in the incarnation, but also in theodicy and others. So I would like it if there's a way that this analogy, those benefits, could be gained by even somebody who isn't a determinist, but sees those values in the analogy. But there are those, including Braxton Hunter. He explicitly said as much when I discussed this with him on the show. He said, I'm not attracted to the analogy, or the thing that holds me back from embracing the analogy is the fact that he is not a determinist, and it seems to him as if the analogy might seem to entail determinism. So here's a question I have for you to speak to non-determinists. What would you say to them, to non-determinists who are reluctant to embrace the analogy because it seems to them to entail determinism? Would you say that yes, that there may be at least some ways in which it could be meaningfully embraced, even by people who reject determinism, or and this would be a perfectly legitimate answer, I'm just curious to hear what it is, would you say that perhaps if it's the best analogy, then so what? You've got to. If it's the best analogy because of those other ways in which it succeeds over other analogies, then if it also entails determinism, then just accept it and bite the bullet. Or would you say something else somewhere in between those extremes? What would you say to people like Braxton watching?
Yeah, I'd say yes to a couple of those things actually. So one, if you hear the logic of dialogical polyphonic authorship, if you're hearing that, oh wow, the causal joint at which God interacts is interjection, and he is bringing things about such that he could determine them, and yet you're still free. If you like that, go ahead, jump on the bandwagon. That's great. Go buy Van Hooser's Remythologizing Theology. It's a great read. He's got lots of puns in there. It's thick and it's dense. So you go slow, but do that. Go ahead and do that. If, however, you don't like determinism, you repent of that. I think the Bible says that. But whatever, man. I got some friends that aren't as well, who are good libertarians. There's other ways you can use it. It might not be a strong analogy. It might not be a strong explanatory analogy, but you can parse it back and you can use it to talk about God's relation with time. So you're discipling someone. You should be for those listening, all of you on every side should be discipling someone. That's our call. When you're discipling someone and they say, "Well, I don't understand how God relates to time," if you're a B theorist, well, it depends. You could probably not be a B theorist too, but how is it that God can be omnipresent? How is it that God can be outside of time? Well, just like Lewis uses this and says, just like an author is writing a story, and he's writing, and it's the pinnacle of the story. Someone's about to do something. They're at Mount Doom, and the ring's about to get thrown in, and then it pauses because Tolkien had to go get a coffee. Well, it doesn't pause. No. The story intranarratively is still going on. They have no idea what's going on with the author at a different level. Such is God's relation to creation, or how can God be everywhere? Well, Tolkien, in a sense, is in every single page of his book. He's in every line. He's in every word because he wrote those. He's omnipresent throughout there. And yes, this is why it's not a strong analogy, because there's instant disanalogy, because he's not really like present in the same way we would say God is present in this reality, but it's a weaker analogy to help us conceptualize how God can be everywhere at once. And so, yeah, I think there's plenty of ways that you can use it. What's her name? And I'm drawing blanks all day today here. I mentioned her a few times already, but I don't know why.
Dorothy.
Dorothy Sayers, Mind of the Maker. She's not a Calvinist. She's a Catholic thinker, and she uses this plenty. Incarnation. Incarnation is probably one of the best ones. So there's different ways you can use this, and I challenge you to find some new ways to represent different doctrines, the God-world relation, and do it in a helpful way. But I do want to argue that I think the best explanatory use of the analogy is the dialogical one, and to do that, you need to be a determinist. And I think this is good because it helps us see how someone can be morally responsible and yet still determined. I think that's a really good thing, because with the Arminian charge that it makes God the author of sin. Look, I don't want to make God the author of sin and evil. I don't like that. I'm glad that you guys continue to raise that. Please keep, holding us to that. We don't want to do that, but we do want to affirm God's sovereignty, and I think this is a helpful way to do it. So, yeah.
Very good.
If it's not, then I'll drop it, right? Yeah.
Well, at least we'd like to think we would.
Yeah.
And I'll just add that I'd be interested to see. I certainly have some suspicions, but I'd be interested to see if there are any non-determinists who could embrace the analogy and maybe work out how a Stephen King style authorship might benefit from all of the things that they would agree with us are beneficial in the analogy, but without the determinism part. Now, you and I would agree that's still unfortunate in that it doesn't reflect the biblical teaching, but of course we could be wrong about the biblical teaching, and as such, I'd be interested to see if anybody's able to roll with that. I guess time will tell. All right. Yeah. Is there any way that viewers can access your thesis now or in the future so that they can read in greater detail what we've been discussing? Maybe is there a way that maybe they could contact you and you could email it to them or something, or is it something you need to keep close to your chest for a while?
Yeah, so I'm going to I'm going to make a couple of changes there. There's some stuff I wanted to add as well. So I want to add an appendix, my paper critiquing the simulation hypothesis and arguing instead for the authorial analogy. So there's some stuff I want to tune up there. And then I've had some friends offer to see if it's publishable, if it's publish worthy. If so, I'm going to need to add like 50 pages to it or something like that. So for now, I'm going to probably hold it closer to the chest, but I will be going through similar in a similar fashion that we've done on my own podcast. So if you want to hear a little bit more about it, you can go ahead and there. I might add some more onto my my blog posts. I might do that. It'll be more in the lay level, because right now I want to beef this up. I want to see if this is publishable. I want to do that. That'd be great. Yeah, so I think the best way is to follow me on social media. Yeah.
Well, and that leads nicely to my final question for you is where can viewers find you on social media, and also where can they go to find Parker's Pensie's blog, podcast, and YouTube channel, so that as you start to do the things that you just described in those places, they'll be able to follow along.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. So you can go to parkersettecase.com. Settecase, parkersettecase.com. That's my blog. That's where the Parker's Pensie's blog is at, and through there you can also find my audio podcast. Yeah, if you look at Spotify or Anchor or Apple Podcasts, any of the big ones there, you just type in Parker's Pensie's, you'll find my audio podcast, and then search my name on YouTube. Or this is kind of funny, if you just search Frogs Eating, my video will be the first one. And you can just click on Parker Settecase, and it'll bring you right to my YouTube channel, where I have some frog videos, but I also have all the videos of my podcast as well.
What did you say to look up? Frogs Eating?
Yeah, Frogs Eating. It should be the first one. Don't make me a liar here.
Well, National Geographic has one before yours, but that National Geographic video has only 2.3 million, and your giant African bullfrogs eating everything in sight, including mice, that video has 37 million, so you've vastly outdone Nat Geo. That's pretty cool.
Every now and then they change the algorithms on me.
I guess.
Yeah.
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 All right. Well, Parker, it's
good.
been an absolute blast having you on the show. I really appreciate it, and I hope that over time maybe we can get to know each other a little bit better. But in the meantime, again, thank you for coming on my show, and I'll encourage people to check out the Parker's Pensées blog, podcast, and YouTube channel. And just thanks for helping us to think through what I think is a really fascinating discussion. Hopefully, viewers find it equally fascinating. Thanks again.
Yeah, awesome, dude. Thanks so much for giving me this platform. Love what you're doing, and I'm excited to see more of what you're doing. So yeah, you got to follow me here.
Well, I suspect, given the small number of viewers that have been watching live, that maybe the God as author analogy isn't as fascinating to most of you as it is to Parker and me, which is a bit of a shame, but that's quite all right. Some of us are into the more esoteric aspects of theology. No big deal. But I do hope that you enjoyed not just this interview with Parker, but also this 3-episode series that I've done. At some point in the future, I might further elaborate on how I think that the God as author analogy might be employed by Calvinistic determinists like myself. But for the time being, I'm going to let this series come to its conclusion with this 3rd entry in the series. And next episode, 2 weeks from today, which will be Monday, January 25th at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, I intend to do an episode on Sola Scriptura. The reason being, I was recently invited to participate in a debate. I was invited by Marlon Wilson, the guy who hosts the show The Gospel Truth. It's a show I've been on before. I've debated the topic of hell there, if I'm remembering correctly. I also debated, actually, I don't think I debated the topic of hell there. I debated limited atonement on that show. But anyway, Marlon invited me to debate a Roman Catholic on the topic of Sola Scriptura. And on March 4th, I think it is, I will be doing a live debate with this Roman Catholic on Marlon's show, in which I will be affirming that Scripture is the sole infallible rule of faith and practice. And so, in to help me to prepare for that debate, I think I'm tentatively planning on doing my next episode of the show in 2 weeks' time on Sola Scriptura to explain why I have the conviction that Scripture is indeed our only infallible rule of faith. Susan asks in the chat if I'm talking live now. Yes, I am. As I said, I introduced the pre-recorded interview live, and I would close it out live. Kyperian Birian asks if I've got James White's book. I've got several of his books. I think I've got the Roman Catholic Controversy, I believe, in Logos Bible Software. Is that the book that you're asking about? I am a big fan of James White and highly respect him, even if I take issue with some of his beliefs and more of his behavior. But I heavily rely upon his work in my own. So yes, I will be Scripture alone. I think I have Kyperian Brian, but I'm not exactly sure. But anyway, so if you have not been particularly enjoying the God as Author Analogy series, come back and give me another shot to secure your interest a little bit better in 2 weeks' time by in an episode in which I present my underdeveloped case for Sola Scriptura in anticipation of my debate with a Roman Catholic about a month or so after that. For those few of you who have watched this live, thank you so very much. It means a lot. Cameron Bertuzzi of Capturing Christianity posted a meme on Facebook today. I think it was today, where it was there were several frames in the meme in which, and in one of them, in them, a YouTuber is talking to his live streamers and thanking them, and then the second to last frame says, live viewers 0, and then the last frame is him saying bye-bye with a tear rolling down his eyes, whatever. The idea being, here you are trying to be a YouTuber and talking to people as if they're watching you live, when in reality nobody is. And Sometimes I feel that way, so I really appreciate those few of you who have stuck around live to watch this. For those of you who are watching after the show has been streamed, thank you as well, just not quite as much. All of you, whether you've watched live or after it's been archived, please do consider liking the video, clicking that thumbs up button on YouTube. If you like some of the material here in the channel, please do subscribe to the channel and click that notifications bell. As the weeks and months progress, I plan to have a whole bunch of really great episodes. And don't forget, if you are interested in learning biblical Hebrew and don't want to spend the time or money to do a traditional formal education in biblical Hebrew, then check out my series in this very channel called Biblical Hebrew 101. You might find it useful. Thank you, Jamie, for saying that you're sharing my stuff and that it's making an impact. I appreciate it. And thank you, Shannon, for saying that you enjoyed the episode. It means a lot. I'll stop rambling. Again, 2 weeks from today, Monday, January 25th at 6 p.m. Pacific, 9 p.m. Eastern, we'll come back here for an episode on Sola Scriptura. And then and in between, 1 week from today, don't forget that on alternating Mondays, I do Rethinking Hell live at the Rethinking Hell YouTube channel. Again, Mondays at 6 p.m. Pacific, so tune in there. And then, Kyperian, to answer your question, will I plan on doing Greek? At some point, yes, but I plan on doing Hebrew, 2 semesters worth of Hebrew first, so it'll be a while before I get to Greek. Thanks again. I really appreciate you tuning in, and I'll talk to you later. See you next time. I've been your host, Chris Date, and thanks so much for watching Theopologetics, where we think together through what we believe, why we believe it, and not something else. If you've enjoyed this episode, please click the thumbs up, like icon, the subscribe button, and the bell icon to receive notifications when new videos are streamed or uploaded. Either way, come back in 2 weeks for the next episode of Theopologetics, streaming live on YouTube every other Monday at 6 p.m. Pacific. Until then...